What would you do if a toxic ex-partner abandoned your newborn child, only for a powerful underworld sovereign to step out of the shadows and legally claim that baby as his own? This is the reality Emma Carter faced when her world fractured, and an immovable billionaire chose to stand as an unbreakable shield between her daughter and a lethal debt collector. Welcome to our channel, a space dedicated to the brilliant minds of mafia bosses men who were born to rule. On this channel, we do not tell cheap crime stories. Instead, we dissect the raw mindset, the unwavering courage, and the hidden strategic secrets behind true, absolute power. These are the brutal lessons the school of life will never teach you, known only by those at the top of the food chain. By watching today's story to the very end, you will discover a profound lesson in survival. True strength isn't about drowning alone in your pride. It is about the wisdom to leverage immense resources to protect what is sacred. If you are ready to elevate your mindset and look past the surface of power, please hit that like button, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to our channel. Let the countdown begin. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like dying wasps, casting everything in the maternity ward a sickly yellow-green. I pressed my palm against the cool glass of the nursery window, watching the tiny bundle wrapped in pink cotton my daughter, still nameless after 3 days because I couldn't bring myself to choose alone. The antiseptic smell burned my nostrils, mixing with the faint scent of milk and exhaustion that clung to my hospital gown. My body ached in places I didn't know could ache, a dull throb that reminded me I'd created life and nearly destroyed myself in the process. I was entirely hollow, drained of whatever strength I had left, when the nurse's voice cut through my fog, telling me that my visitor was still in the waiting room and had been there since this morning. She said Vizizin, but she meant Derek, my ex, the father who had looked at our daughter through the same glass yesterday and said he needed a paternity test before he would sign anything. We had spent 3 years together, 9 months of me carrying his child while he quietly moved on to someone with a trust fund and a degree from Yale. And now, in my lowest moment, he wanted proof. I pressed my forehead against the glass, feeling it fog with my breath as I stared at her through my reflection. She was impossibly small, impossibly perfect, with dark wisps of hair and tiny fingers curled into fists like she was already ready to fight the world. She deserved so much better than this. Better than a mother who had dropped out of college to wait tables. And certainly better than a father who treated her birth certificate like a business contract. I turned to the nurse and whispered for her to tell him I was sleeping. She squeezed my shoulder with practiced sympathy, the kind they probably taught in nursing school alongside wound care and bedside manner. As she walked away, her rubber-soled shoes squeaking against the linoleum, I caught sight of movement in the hallway reflection. A man appeared. He was tall, wearing a dark suit that probably cost more than my monthly rent, and he moved differently than the doctors and regular visitors, purposeful, predatory. Even from behind, I could see the deference in how people stepped aside for him. The very nurse who had just left my side actually pressed herself against the wall, her eyes downcast as he passed. My breath caught in my throat. He stopped 3 doors down from the nursery, speaking in low tones to someone I couldn't see, his Italian leather shoes gleaming under the terrible fluorescent lights. His dark hair was cut precisely, not a single strand out of place, and when he turned slightly, I glimpsed a sharp jawline, the kind of profile that belonged on Roman coins or in magazines I couldn't afford. Then his security guard appeared, a mountain of a man in a black suit with an earpiece, carrying what looked like a hospital bassinet covered with an expensive blanket. Something about the scene made my stomach twist. The way the nurses watched this man with fear disguised as respect. The way he commanded space without saying a word. And the subtle bulge under his guard's jacket that definitely wasn't a phone, it all screamed danger. I should have looked away and gone back to my room to deal with Derek, his demands for DNA tests, and his new girlfriend who had already posted pregnancy announcements on social media. But I couldn't stop watching. He moved to the nursery window, standing almost exactly where I had been moments before. His reflection in the glass was all sharp angles and shadows, beautiful in a way that made you think of fallen angels and Greek tragedies. When he looked at the babies, something flickered across his face loss, longing, something raw that made him human for just a second before his eyes shifted and found mine in the reflection. Those eyes, dark, intense, and burning with something I couldn't name, held me frozen like a rabbit in headlights. and the corner of his mouth lifted in a barely noticeable acknowledgement. Then Derek's voice shattered the moment, demanding that we talk because his lawyer had guidelines to follow. I spun around, my hospital gown swishing against my legs, to find Derek standing there with his new girlfriend, Brittany, hovering behind him like a designer accessory. She was all highlighted hair and yoga pants that probably cost more than my car payment, holding her hand on her stomach in that proprietary way pregnant women do, even though she couldn't be more than 12 weeks along. When I confronted him about bringing lawyers when our daughter was barely 3 days old, he had the audacity to look annoyed, telling me to be reasonable and that I knew how these things worked. He claimed he just needed to verify, a word that tasted like poison to me after being faithful to him for 3 years. When I began to shout the truth, he snapped at me not to make a scene, glancing around in embarrassment because he was always worried about appearances and what people thought. Brittany interjected with fake sweetness, suggesting I just register the baby under my own name to solve the problem. Something inside me cracked under the weight of the exhaustion, the hormones, and the sheer agony of knowing I couldn't give my daughter what she deserved. I ordered them to get out, my voice rising until the nurses looked over and the man in the expensive suit tilted his head, interest sharpening in his dangerous eyes. Derek held up his hands as if I were being hysterical, telling me to call him when I was ready to be reasonable before leaving with Brittany, her heels clicking against the floor like tiny hammers. I stood there shaking, refusing to let the tears fall where everyone could see me completely falling apart. Bastardo, a deep, accented voice said beside me, wrapping around the Italian curse like velvet over steel. I jerked, not having heard him approach, and found myself face to face with the man from the hallway, up close. He was devastating, not handsome in the conventional sense, but compelling in a way that made it hard to look away. He looked to be in his late 20s or early 30s, with dark eyes that had seen too much, full lips that looked like they'd forgotten how to smile, and a small scar through his left eyebrow that somehow made him more attractive. He smelled of expensive cologne mixed with something darker, like gunpowder or the leather interior of luxury cars. When I faintly asked if I knew him, he studied me with an unsettling intensity, stating that he knew weak, selfish men like Derek who walk away when life becomes inconvenient. He glanced toward the nursery, noting that my daughter was beautiful and shared my eyes. When I questioned how he could know that, he answered with absolute certainty, adding that she deserved better than a father who demanded proof and a mother breaking herself, trying to hold everything together alone. He moved closer, radiating heat in the frigid air conditioning, and told me he knew I hadn't cried until I thought no one was watching. You're stronger than you think. Emma Carter, he said, and hearing my name in his mouth sent a shiver down my spine. He introduced himself as Dante Salvatore, explaining that he paid attention to the nurses because it was how he stayed alive. It should have been a warning to run, but I was too tired of being afraid and alone. Dante looked at his guard, exchanged a silent communication, and offered to solve my birth certificate problem using his resources and connections. When I asked why he would do this, he replied simply and terrifyingly, because I can. Because men like him shouldn't have power over women like you. And because I want to. Every instinct screamed that this man was dangerous. But I looked back at Sophia sleeping peacefully, and I asked what he wanted in return. Dante smiled a slow, predatory smile, stating we would discuss terms later, before pulling out one of several phones to make a rapid call in Italian. When he hung up, he promised his lawyer would be there within the hour to handle everything legally without Derek's signature. I protested that the law required it, but he softly interrupted, saying the law was flexible when you knew the right people. He stepped closer, his dark eyes flecked with gold, and clarified that he wasn't asking for money, he was asking for time, for a dinner and a conversation once I recovered. I knew in my bones there was more to it, my body responding to his proximity with equal parts terror and an unnameable attraction. But I whispered a confirmation. Before I could think through the implications, his older lawyer appeared with a briefcase, and Dante commanded him to handle the documentation for Emma Carter's daughter. The lawyer turned to me with practiced efficiency, asking for the baby's name, caught between safe poverty and dangerous luxury. I heard myself say, Sophia. Sophia Grace Carter. Dante murmured that it was beautiful, and the way he said it made it clear he wasn't just talking about the name. The next morning, I woke to find crisp, official legal documents stamped with unfamiliar but legitimate-looking seals on the table beside my bed. It was Sophia's birth certificate, complete with my signature, and a father's line that simply read, "Declined to establish paternity, no DNA test or permission from Derek required." I called the county clerk's office twice to confirm it was real. Yet the invisible price tag hovered over me like a storm cloud. Soon, the morning nurse bustled in with forced cheerfulness to clear us for discharge, telling me we were free to go home. Home was a one-bedroom apartment with a leaking faucet and fighting neighbors, where a second-hand car seat sat in my closet. I had exactly $400 in my bank account and no job, since the diner had replaced me the second I went into labor. 2 hours later, I stood in the hospital lobby in the September heat, holding Sophia in a cheap Target outfit, surrounded by happy families while I faced a growing sense of panic. Then my phone buzzed with an unknown number. "A car is waiting for you outside. Driver will take you home. D." Through the glass doors sat a black Mercedes sedan with tinted windows and a sharply dressed driver. I wanted to refuse, but Sophia began to whimper for food. My breasts ached. My incision pulled, and my Uber app was stuck searching for a driver. The driver nodded to me discreetly, and bypassing my stubborn pride for my daughter's sake, I approached the vehicle. He opened the door to reveal a top-of-the-line infant seat already professionally installed, stating that Mr. Salvatore sent his regards and that it was an investment in ensuring his goddaughter arrived home safely. The word goddaughter strangled me. But the interior was cool, and inside the cup holder sat a bottle of water next to a gift bag containing organic diapers, premium wipes, European formula, and a check for 50. My phone buzzed again with another message from Dante, telling me to accept it as a loan to keep from drowning, proving he knew everything about my address, my history, and my fears. It should have terrified me, but instead, a dangerous warmth unfurled in my chest because someone finally saw the terrified girl underneath. He textually requested dinner for the next night at 7, overriding my excuses about a newborn by stating his housekeeper would keep Sophia safe at his house. When I asked why, his response felt like truth wrapped in barbed wire. Because 10 years ago, someone should have helped my sister when she needed it. No one did. She died alone and afraid. As the driver helped me set up a brand new stroller outside my apartment, I heard myself agree to the time. Stepping onto the cracked sidewalk with 50, I couldn't afford to refuse, completely unaware of how deeply I was about to fall into Dante Salvatore's world. The 30 hours following my return to that cramped, suffocating studio apartment passed in a dizzying, relentless blur of survival. Every ticking second of the clock felt like a heavy weight pressing down on my chest as I navigated the exhausting reality of being entirely responsible for a tiny, fragile human life. Sophia woke every 2 hours, her sharp, piercing cries echoing off the thin, water-stained walls of the apartment. Each time she cried, my heart would hammer against my ribs, panic flaring in my veins as I clumsily tried to soothe her, my hands still shaking from the lingering trauma of the hospital and the overwhelming weight of my new reality. I sat on the edge of my mismatched, second-hand mattress, nursing her in the dim light of a single flickering bulb, my body aching intensely from the fresh incision that pulled painfully with every slight movement. Every creak of the floorboards from the neighbors upstairs made me jump, and during the rare moments of absolute silence, I found myself hovering over her bassinet, holding my breath just to ensure she was still breathing. The check Dante had given me, that impossibly heavy piece of paper worth $5,000, sat on the chipped kitchen counter like a ticking time bomb. I hated myself for it. Every ounce of my stubborn, hard-earned pride screamed at me to tear it into pieces and throw it away. But then I would look at the empty refrigerator. Think about the landlord who would ruthlessly evict me the moment my rent was a day late. And look at the premium cans of European formula sitting in the gift bag. Survival, I realized bitterly, didn't have room for pride. On the second morning, with my stomach knotting in shame, I walked down to the local check cashing place, the heavy iron bars on their windows reminding me exactly where I lived. I cashed it. The cash felt thick and dirty in my hands. But as I walked back and immediately paid my back rent, bought a mountain of groceries, and stocked up on more diapers and wipes than my small closet could hold, a suffocating layer of panic finally lifted from my shoulders. For the first time in 9 months, I could breathe without feeling like the sky was about to crush me. Yet, the invisible price tag of that breathing room hovered over me like an approaching storm cloud. And as the clock ticked closer to 7 o'clock in the evening, the terror of what I had agreed to began to take over. By 6:30, I was standing in front of my tiny, open closet, staring at the pathetic collection of clothes I owned and realizing with absolute dread that I had nothing appropriate for a dinner with a man of Dante Salvatore's stature. He was a man who likely had politicians, judges, and police chiefs on his payroll. A man who commanded entire rooms without uttering a single word. And here I was, an unemployed waitress, trying to piece together an outfit from charity shop finds. My hands brushed past faded jeans and worn t-shirts until I settled on a simple, long-sleeve black dress. It was the dress I had worn to my cousin's funeral 2 years ago. A somber, modest piece that used to fit me perfectly. But as I pulled it over my head and zipped it up, I realized it hung loosely around my frame. The combination of a brutal pregnancy, a terrifying delivery, and days of sheer stress had stolen 15 pounds from my body that I couldn't afford to lose. It looked slightly draped and hollow, but it was clean. It was modest, and it was the absolute best I had to offer. I washed my face with cold water, trying to bring some color back into my hollow cheeks, and tied my unwashed hair back into a neat, tight bun to hide the days of neglect. I fed Sophia one last time, burped her gently until she let out a soft sigh, and changed her into the cleanest, softest white onesie from the hospital bag. My mind was a battlefield, a vicious voice screaming that I was making a catastrophic mistake, that I was selling my soul to a wolf in an expensive suit. But as I looked at the security of the heavily engineered stroller and the wealth stacked in my kitchen, I knew there was no turning back. At exactly 7 o'clock, a heavy, synchronized knock echoed through my door, making me flinch. I took a deep, steadying breath, gathered Sophia into her pristine, top-of-the-line car seat, grabbed the diaper bag, and unlocked the door. Standing in the dimly lit hallway was a young man I hadn't seen before. He didn't wear the relaxed demeanor of a regular driver. His eyes were calculating, cold, and sharp as they swept the hallway behind me, cataloging the shadows before he even looked at my face. He introduced himself as Marco, stating calmly that he would be escorting me for the evening. He reached out with effortless courtesy, taking the heavy diaper bag from my shoulder and gesturing for me to follow him down the narrow, graffiti-lined stairwell. Outside, the sleek black Mercedes sedan sat idling against the curb, its heavily tinted windows reflecting the harsh streetlights of my neighborhood, making the entire car look like an intrusive shadow from another world. Marco opened the rear door for me with practiced fluidity, and as I slid onto the flawless leather seats, the heavy door closed with a solid, muted thunk that instantly cut off the distant sounds of sirens and shouting neighbors, plunging us into a cool, climate-controlled silence. The scent inside was intoxicatingly familiar leather, polished wood, and that faint, dangerous undertone of Dante's expensive cologne that seemed to cling to everything he touched. The drive took a grueling 40 minutes, tracing a path away from the cracked concrete and chain-link fences of the city center and heading deep into the rolling hills where the city's grid dissolved into sprawling, secluded estates. The houses here didn't have numbers. They had massive stone pillars, towering privacy hedges, and heavy iron gates that demanded permission to pass. We turned onto a long, winding private road flanked by ancient oak trees, the headlights cutting through the descending darkness until we reached a security checkpoint that made airport screening look utterly casual. Two armed men in crisp suits stepped out of a small guardhouse, their eyes scanning the interior of the car with lethal intensity. Marco lowered his window, speaking a few brief, sharp words in rapid Italian into a radio console, and with a low, hydraulic hum, the massive, intricate iron gates swung open to reveal the estate beyond. Calling the structure before me a house was an understatement. It was a sprawling, ultra-modern compound that looked like a fortress carved out of glass, steel, and dark stone. A perfectly blended cutting-edge architecture with old-world security. Even in the dim evening light, I could see the subtle glint of security cameras turning at every corner, guards positioned at precise intervals along the perimeter, and powerful spotlights that looked like they could illuminate the night sky. A breathless curse escaped my lips before I could stop it, causing Marco's eyes to catch mine in the rearview mirror, a tiny knowing twitch flickering at the corner of his lips as he murmured that Mr. Salvatore valued his privacy above all else. We pulled up to a grand, sweeping main entrance where the massive front doors were already open, casting a warm, brilliant amber light onto the stone driveway. Standing right there in the center of the light, waiting for the car to stop, was Dante Salvatore. He had traded the immaculate, high-priced suit from the hospital for a more relaxed appearance. But it didn't make him look any less dangerous. He wore tailored dark slacks and a black silk button-down shirt with the sleeves rolled tightly up to his elbows, exposing thick forearms roped with corded muscle and the dark, intricate ink of a tattoo that disappeared beneath his cuff. He possessed a terrifyingly casual wealth, an elegance so sharp it felt predatory. Before Marco could even step out of the vehicle, Dante moved with fluid, athletic grace, pulling my car door open himself. He looked down at me, those dark, gold-flecked eyes locking onto mine, and uttered my name with a low, resonant gravity that made it sound entirely different, significant, heavy, and completely binding. I tried to climb out of the low sedan gracefully while maneuvering Sophia's bulky car seat, but my exhausted, aching body betrayed me, and I stumbled slightly on the stone driveway before I could fall. Dante's large, warm hand clamped firmly around my elbow, steadying my weight with effortless strength. The sudden, intense contact sent a jolt of literal electricity straight down to my bones, a spark of heat that burned through the thin fabric of my funeral dress and left me breathless. He murmured for me to take it easy, his voice dropping into a low, soothing cadence as he gently reached past me and took the car seat from my hands. He handled the heavy plastic carrier with an astonishing, fluid gentleness, cradling my daughter as if he had done it 1,000 times before. He looked down into the carrier, his sharp features softening for a fraction of a second as he remarked that she had already grown, questioning if it was even possible in such a short time. I cleared my throat, my voice trembling slightly as I whispered that it had only been 2 days. Dante shifted his gaze back to me, something dark, intense, and possessively fiercely flickering in the depths of his eyes as he corrected me, stating softly that it had been exactly 2 days and 17 hours but questioned, with a dangerous tilt of his head. Who was counting? He turned and guided me through the grand entrance, ushering me into a foyer that belonged in an architectural magazine. The floors were made of pristine, gleaming white marble that reflected a massive crystal chandelier overhead, casting brilliant, prismatic light across walls adorned with artwork that probably cost more than every apartment building on my old street combined. Yet, despite the staggering wealth, the space didn't feel entirely cold or sterile. The air was filled with the rich, inviting aroma of fresh flowers, warm wood accents, and the mouth-watering scent of garlic, herbs, and slow-cooking sauce drifting from the back of the house. Dante raised his voice slightly, calling out for Maria. And within moments, an elegant woman in her late 60s emerged from a side hallway. She wore a simple, crisp apron, her kind, deeply lined face lighting up with genuine joy the moment her eyes fell upon the car seat. Dante introduced her, explaining that Maria had essentially raised him after his own mother passed away, and assured me with absolute confidence that if anyone in the world could handle a newborn, it was her. Maria was already moving forward, her hands moving with practiced, maternal expertise as she unclipped Sophia from the carrier and scooped her into her arms, cooing softly and rapid, melodic Italian. She looked up at me, her eyes sweeping over my exhausted face, and told me to go, to have dinner and relax with Dante, promising she would take the absolute best care of the little one. She noted that Sophia likely needed a fresh diaper and perhaps a bottle, prompting me to quickly stammer that while I was breastfeeding. I had pumped a bottle just in case. Maria smiled warmly, cutting off my anxiety by insisting they had everything they could possibly need, and told me to eat, bluntly stating that I looked like I hadn't had a proper meal in weeks. Before I could utter a single word of protest or let my overprotective panic take over, Maria had already swept down the hallway, her voice fading into gentle Italian lullabies as she carried my daughter away into the heart of the fortress, leaving me entirely alone with the most dangerous man I had ever met. Dante stepped closer, his deep voice echoing softly in the grand foyer as he agreed with Maria, murmuring that she was right and that I looked entirely starved. He placed his large, warm hand at the small of my back, a possessive, highly protective gesture that felt like a brand burning straight through the thin black fabric of my dress. He guided me effortlessly through the labyrinthine hallways of the mansion, leading me toward a set of massive glass French doors that opened up onto a breathtaking, expansive stone terrace. The terrace overlooked immaculate, sprawling grounds that seemed to stretch out into the dark horizon forever, flanked by manicured gardens and towering stone walls. In the center of the terrace, a small, intimate table was meticulously set for two, a pair of tall candles flickering gently against the soft evening breeze. A silver bucket held a bottle of wine chilling on ice, and the table was already laden with platters of food that smelled like absolute heaven. Dante pulled out a heavy wrought iron chair, instructing me to sit with a quiet, calm authority that wasn't a request, but a total order wrapped in silk. I sat down, my legs feeling slightly hollow, and watched as he walked to the other side of the table. He poured a rich, dark red wine into his own glass. But when he reached for my glass, he poured crisp, chilled sparkling water instead. I looked up, surprised, and he met my gaze with an unsettling steadiness, murmuring simply that I was nursing and that he remembered everything that mattered. He sat down across from me, moving with that terrifying, predatory grace that defined every breath he took, and gestured to the food, telling me to eat first. And then we would talk about why he had really brought me to his home. My stomach instantly dropped into a cold pit of dread as his words echoed in the quiet space. The $5,000. The birth certificate. The luxury car seat. It hadn't been an act of pure charity. And as I looked into his dark, unreadable eyes, he confirmed my worst fear with a sharp, blade-thin smile, stating coldly that it was an investment. And now it was time to discuss the returns. Despite the icy wave of fear that flooded my veins, the raw, primal demands of my body took over the moment I looked down at the plate. The food was nothing short of incredible. There was handmade pasta tossed in a rich, deep crimson sauce that tasted as if someone's grandmother had spent days slow cooking it to perfection. Baskets of fresh, crusty bread that was still steaming from the oven, and roasted vegetables that actually burst with vibrant flavor. I tried with every shred of dignity I possessed to eat slowly, to maintain some semblance of composure and control, but I was utterly starving. For 18 months, my diet had consisted of cold hospital cafeteria food, grease-laden diner scraps, and cheap, frozen television dinners eaten over a metal sink. I ate with a desperate ferocity I couldn't hide. Dante didn't eat. He leaned back slightly in his heavy chair, barely touching the food on his own plate as he watched me with an unsettling, laser-focused intensity. Every single time I dared to look up from my plate, those dark, intense eyes were locked onto mine, cataloging the movement of my throat, analyzing my expressions, and possessing me through sight alone. The silence became too heavy to bear, the heat of his gaze crawling up my neck until I finally set my fork down, reached for my water glass to avoid his eyes, and told him that he wasn't eating. Dante swirled the dark wine in his glass, the corner of his mouth lifting slightly as he confessed that he was enjoying watching me eat. He paused for a moment, his eyes darkening as he searched for the exact word, before stating that there was something profoundly honest about the way I experienced pleasure, no pretense, no performance. Just raw, genuine enjoyment. A brilliant, burning heat crept violently up my neck and into my cheeks. The low, velvet cadence of his voice made the word pleasure sound utterly obscene and terrifyingly intimate in the quiet evening air. I swallowed hard, gripping the cold glass of water, and desperately tried to steer the conversation back to safer, more logical ground, demanding to know what he meant by the returns on his investment. Dante leaned back further into his chair, the flickering candlelight dancing across the sharp, hard angles of his face and casting long, ominous shadows across the stone terrace. Behind him, the sun had fully set, painting the vast horizon in brutal shades of blood orange and deeply bruised purple, making him look like a beautiful, terrifying creature stepped straight out of a dark Renaissance painting. He set his wineglass down with slow, deliberate care and began to speak of my ex, uttering Derek Morrison's name with a cold detachment that made my skin prickle. He detailed Derek's life with terrifying accuracy, stating that he worked as a junior partner for his father's investment firm, Morrison and Associates. He acknowledged that Derek made decent money, but noted that it was nothing extraordinary, certainly not enough to afford the penthouse downtown, the pristine Porsche he drove, or the staggering jewelry his new girlfriend flaunted, which cost more than his entire annual salary. I blinked in sheer shock, my breath catching as I demanded to know how he could possibly know all of that. Dante's smile was blade thin, entirely devoid of warmth, as he stated simply that he made it his absolute business to know things. He leveled his gaze at me and delivered a truth that shattered my understanding of the past 3 years, revealing that Derek had been systematically stealing from his father's wealthiest clients for the past 18 months. He had been cleverly hiding small amounts from various accounts, totaling almost $3 million in fraud. My hand shook so violently that my fork clattered loudly against the porcelain plate, echoing like a gunshot on the quiet terrace. I shook my head, stammering that it was completely impossible, that Derek was greedy and selfish. But he wasn't nearly smart enough to orchestrate that kind of high-level financial fraud. Dante nodded once, his eyes cold, agreeing with me completely. He explained that Derek wasn't smart enough, which was exactly how he knew someone else was pulling the strings behind the scenes, someone who needed a weak, easily manipulated, greedy man with direct access to other people's millions. Someone who was using Derek as a shield and would eventually feed him to the federal authorities the absolute second the legal heat got too close. I gripped the edge of the table, my voice cracking as I asked what any of this corporate fraud had to do with me or my innocent daughter. Dante leaned forward, the distance between us dissolving as his dark eyes locked onto mine, and explained that 3 months ago, Derek made the fatal mistake of stealing money from the wrong account. It was an account that belonged to a high-level associate of his, a very particular kind of businessman who did not forgive theft, regardless of the amount, and who wanted his $3 million back with staggering interest. And with blood. My mouth went entirely dry, the cold air freezing in my throat as the pieces of the puzzle violently slammed together, and I whispered the word aloud, asking if he was saying that Derek had stolen from the Mafia. Dante didn't flinch. He merely clarified that Derek had stolen from a dangerous man with deep connections to various powerful organizations, including his own Salvatore family, and that Derek had officially made himself a lethal target. He looked at me with an absolute, chilling lack of emotion and delivered the final, devastating blow, stating that when men like his associate deal with targets, they do not worry about collateral damage. They don't spare girlfriends, ex-girlfriends, or newborn children. Ice flooded my veins, my heart stopping entirely as the image of Sophia's perfect, tiny face flashed in my mind, and I gasped out her name, asking if he was telling me that my daughter was in mortal danger because of the white-collar crimes of the coward who abandoned her. Dante nodded slowly, his voice dropping into a deadly, unyielding whisper as he confirmed that she could be, unless someone with far more power, far more terror, and far more lethal influence made it absolutely clear to the entire world that Emma Carter and her daughter were under the permanent, untouchable protection of the Salvatore name, and that touching either of them would be considered an immediate declaration of total war. The silence that followed Dante's declaration hung heavily in the air, a physical weight that pressed down on my chest until I felt like I was drowning in the cold, stark reality of his words. My mind raced, frantically trying to piece together the fragments of the man I thought I knew for 3 years, with the image of a hunted embezzler who had inadvertently signed a death warrant for his own child. I pushed back from the table, my wrought iron chair scraping harshly against the stone terrace, as I stood up on legs that felt as fragile as glass. I couldn't look at the incredible food anymore. It felt like a trap, a beautifully orchestrated distraction designed to lower my guard before the jaws of his world snapped shut around me. I backed away toward the edge of the terrace, my hands gripping the cold stone railing behind my back until my knuckles turned white, realizing with a spike of panic that there was nowhere left to run. I looked at Dante, my voice shaking with a volatile mixture of anger and absolute terror as I accused him of insanity, demanding to know if he was using my innocent daughter as sick leverage just to get back at Derek or prove some twisted point to his criminal associates. Dante didn't flinch at my outburst. He stood up slowly, moving around the table with that same fluid, athletic grace that made him look less like a man and more like an apex predator stalking its prey in the moonlight. He stopped just inches away from me, invading my personal space until I could feel the intense heat radiating off his body despite the chilling evening breeze. He smelled of that intoxicating high priest cologne and that darker, metallic undertone that I now realized was the undeniable scent of absolute danger. He looked down at me, his dark eyes boring into my soul with an unsettling intensity as he denied my accusation, stating calmly that he wasn't using Sophia as leverage. He was offering us real, tangible protection from consequences we had no part in creating, but would inevitably suffer if we remained exposed to the world. He leaned in closer, his voice dropping into a low, gravelly register that vibrated straight through my bones as he made his true intentions crystal clear, stating that men like him did nothing without a return. And what he wanted simply, absolutely, and terrifyingly, was me. My breath caught violently in my throat, the air freezing in my lungs as I stared up at the sharp, uncompromising angles of his face under the flickering candlelight. I stammered out a weak, broken question, asking him to define exactly what he meant, wondering if he expected me to be his mistress, his kept woman, or some decorative object to be locked away in his fortress. Dante's jaw tightened, a dangerous shadow crossing his features as he firmly rejected my words, stating that he was not a mob boss and he wasn't looking for a captive. He clarified that he was a businessman with highly complicated associations, and he wasn't asking for my freedom. He was offering me more genuine freedom than a girl like me had ever experienced in her entire life. He reached up, his large, warm fingers ghosting along my jawline without quite touching the skin. Yet the mere proximity left a trail of fire in its wake. He explained his vision with a chilling, possessive certainty, stating that he wanted me and Sophia in his home, under his name, his care, and his absolute protection. He wanted the peace of mind that came with knowing we were safe when he woke up and when he came home, ensuring that no one in the world could ever reach out to harm us without going through him first. He painted a picture of a life where I would never again have to lose sleep over late rent, never have to choose between buying food or diapers, and never have to exhaust my body to the point of collapse at a dead-end job that barely paid enough to cover a cheap, dangerous daycare. He was offering a total sanctuary, a fortress of absolute security. But when I asked him at what cost, his answer was single, absolute and unyielding: loyalty, honesty, my presence in his life. And eventually, when I was completely ready, everything else I was willing to give. Every single survival instinct I had developed over a lifetime of neglect screamed at me to push him away, to scream for Maria to bring me my baby, and to demand that Marco drive us back to the safety of our cramped, predictable poverty. But as I stood there, trapped between his massive frame and the endless drop of the terrace, his words struck a deep, agonizing chord within my soul. I was so bone-tired, so utterly exhausted from years of fighting a losing battle against a world that didn't care if I lived or died. The terror of knowing I was entirely incapable of protecting Sophia from the ruthless wolves hunting her father collided with the desperate, intoxicating hope that maybe, just maybe, this dangerous man was strong enough to shield her. I whispered that I didn't even know him, my voice breaking in the darkness. But Dante merely stepped closer until his chest almost brushed against mine, repeating that I knew enough. I knew he kept his promises. I knew he possessed the limitless resources to keep us safe. And I knew that when he swore we would be protected, he meant it with every connection, every weapon, and every favor at his disposal. He cupped my cheek with surprising, tender gentleness, his thumb tracing my cheekbone, as he admitted that he hadn't stopped thinking about me since the moment he saw me in that hospital hallway, standing tall and fighting for my daughter, as if she were worth defying the entire world for. When I brokenly asked why he would choose me when he could have any beautiful, sophisticated woman from his own elite world, he traced his thumb over my lower lip, stealing the last of my breath as he confessed that he didn't want the women from his world. He called them expensive, perfect, cold sculptures, whereas I was real, fiercely protective, and possessed a depth of love that he thought had died with his sister. Tears burned fiercely behind my eyes as I argued that people didn't just uproot their entire lives to move in with a dangerous stranger. But Dante pressed his forehead against mine, the overwhelming intimacy of the gesture freezing the blood in my veins as he whispered that people in his world did things faster because they understood how quickly everything could be stolen away. He wasn't asking for my love. Not yet. He was merely ordering me to let him protect us while we figured out the undeniable, terrifying connection pulling us together. God help me. He was completely right, and my traitorous body betrayed my mind by leaning into his immense warmth, craving the absolute security his presence represented. Perhaps it wasn't a betrayal at all, but a primal survival instinct recognizing a predator strong enough to keep all the other predators of the world at bay. I took a trembling breath and asked him what the specific rules would be if I agreed to stay. and Dante outlined a compromise that felt surprisingly respectful. He promised that I would have my own private suite, a bedroom, bathroom, and sitting room where I would have complete, unyielding privacy whenever I desired it. Maria would handle the heavy logistics of childcare so I could finally sleep, recover my broken body, and have time to my own thoughts. And I would have unrestricted access to his drivers and cars. In return, the only mandates were that I have dinner with him whenever he was home. Let him get to know the woman behind the mask and give this strange arrangement a genuine chance. When I cautiously asked what would happen if I eventually decided to leave, a dark, unreadable flicker crossed his eyes as he swore he would never hold me prisoner. But he warned me with brutal honesty that leaving meant walking away from total security and leaving Sophia exposed to a reality where Derek's massive debt still existed, whether I was under the Salvatore roof or not, was a masterful piece of psychological manipulation. But as I turned back to look at the vast, darkened grounds, I knew it was also the absolute truth. I asked how I could possibly know he was telling the truth about the danger, and Dante stepped up right behind me, his chest nearly pressing against my back, as he softly pointed out that he had no reason to invent such an elaborate lie for a woman he had just met unless his interest was entirely genuine. He rejected my bitter comment that men like him simply like to collect and own broken things, telling me with a low, gravelly reverence that I wasn't broken, but bent. Broken things shatter under pressure, but bent things flex, adapt, and become infinitely stronger. He didn't want to fix me. He wanted to protect me while I found my own strength. Before the emotional weight of his words could crush me, a soft movement from the doorway broke the spell, and we turned to find Maria cradling a soundly sleeping Sophia in her arms. Maria reported with a gentle smile that the baby had taken her bottle beautifully and was now resting like an angel, adding that she had placed her in the bassinet of the blue suite, and suggesting that perhaps I would like to see the rooms. Dante looked down at me, the silent question burning in his intense gaze, and I knew this was the ultimate crossroads of my life. I could go back to the cramped apartment and wait for the shadows of Derek's sins to burst through my door, or I could step into this terrifying, gilded fortress with a man who might demand my very souls, but promised to stand as an unbreakable wall between my daughter and the cruelty of the world. I looked at my peaceful daughter, then back at Dante's dangerous, compelling eyes, and whispered the words that sealed our fate, asking Maria to show me the rooms. The blue suite was located on the second floor of the mansion, an expansive wing of the house that completely redefined my understanding of luxury. It wasn't just a bedroom. It was a sprawling sanctuary designed in soothing tones of cream and soft blues, featuring a master bedroom with a bed large enough to sleep 4 people comfortably. There was a magnificent sitting area equipped with plush, high-end furniture and an elegant stone fireplace, and a master bathroom that was literally larger than my entire city apartment, boasting a deep porcelain soaking tub and a walk-in shower with more specialized jets than I could count. But the detail that completely shattered my composure was the connected nursery. It was a masterpiece of design, perfect in every single detail. From the hand-painted murals of woodland creatures on the walls to a beautiful wooden rocking chair positioned perfectly to catch the warm morning light. Dante stood in the doorway, his hands casually shoved into his slacks, as he quietly informed me that the nursery had been finished just this afternoon, revealing that he had contracted teams of decorators to work around the clock since the day before. I was utterly speechless, my mind struggling to process the terrifying reality of a man who could command an entire custom nursery to be designed, constructed, and fully furnished in less than 48 hours just because he wanted to accommodate a child that wasn't even his. Maria gently laid Sophia down into a designer bassinet that probably cost more than my car, the baby not even stirring as she remained lost in the deep, contented sleep of a well-fed newborn. Maria squeezed my shoulder with genuine warmth as she passed, letting me know she would leave us to discuss the details and pointing out an intercom panel by the door that I could press if I needed absolutely anything at all. Once she disappeared down the hall, Dante pointed out that the massive walk-in closet was already fully stocked with comfortable, casual clothes in my exact size, as well as a limitless supply of premium baby essentials designed to last for months. I walked over and opened the closet doors, finding rows of soft cotton pajamas, nursing-friendly tops, and lounge pants that were profoundly thoughtful rather than flashy. completely lacking the ostentatious style of a bot woman. When I whispered a question, asking when he could have possibly managed all of this, Dante moved closer but maintained a respectful distance, stating calmly that he made decisions quickly and never hesitated once he decided he wanted something. He told me I could sleep here tonight to see how it felt, promising with absolute sincerity that if I woke up in the morning and decided this world wasn't right for me, Marco would drive me back to my apartment with no judgment and zero consequences. I looked at him, searching his hard face for any sign of a trap, and asked if he would truly just let me walk away. Dante's jaw tightened as he swore he would, though he added that he would still do everything in his power to protect us from a distance because that was simply what you did for the people you cared about, pausing abruptly, as if he had almost uttered a much heavier word. I told him I needed time to think, and he nodded with quiet respect, telling me he would be in his study if I needed anything, before wishing us a peaceful night and slipping out of the room. I walked over to the massive glass window, staring out at the heavily fortified grounds and the towering concrete walls that kept the dangerous world at bay. Derek was out there somewhere, drowning in a sea of his own criminal greed, and invisible threats lurked in every shadow I couldn't see. But here, inside this magnificent stone fortress, with the terrifying protection of a powerful man wrapped around us like heavy armor, my daughter was entirely safe. And for the first time in my life, I realized that maybe, just maybe, I could be safe too. I didn't sleep a single wink that night. The sheer velocity of the changes crashing over my life made it impossible to quiet my mind. Every single time I attempted to close my eyes, I saw the blinding intensity of Dante's gaze, felt the ghost of his possessive touch on my skin, and wondered if the golden sanctuary he was offering would eventually turn into a velvet cage that would swallow me whole. Sophia woke up twice to feed, and each time I sat in that expensive wooden rocking chair in the dim light, staring at the perfect nursery he had built in less than 2 days, wondering what kind of immense power could command such reality and what he would ultimately expect from me when the bill for his protection came due. By the time the first pale rays of dawn began to filter through the heavy blinds, my exhaustion and terror had made the choice for me. I could not do this alone anymore. At 6 o'clock in the morning, wearing a set of the incredibly soft cotton pajamas from his closet, I quietly walked down the grand staircase and found Dante in his massive, wood-paneled study. He looked as if he hadn't slept either, standing by a towering window with a phone pressed to his ear, speaking in rapid, dangerous bursts of low Italian that sounded like lethal threats wrapped in expensive silk. The moment his eyes found me standing frozen in the doorway, he ended the call immediately without a single word of farewell and crossed the room toward me in 3 long, powerful strides, his face tight with concern as he demanded to know if everything was all right with Sophia. I wrapped my arms tightly around myself, suddenly hyper-aware of my vulnerable appearance, and told him that Sophia was perfectly fine and sleeping. I took a deep, steadying breath and delivered my terms, stating that I needed to go back to my studio apartment to gather our personal belongings and handle a few practical matters, adding firmly that if we were going to do this, it would be on a strict trial basis. If at any single point I felt uncomfortable, unsafe, or realized I had made a catastrophic mistake, I would leave immediately with no arguments from him. A fierce primal flash of absolute satisfaction and triumph washed over Dante's features as he agreed to my terms a bit too easily, immediately stating that he would have Marco drive me and that a full security detail would accompany us to the city. I held up a sharp hand, fiercely rejecting the idea, and explained that my apartment was a tiny studio located in a notoriously dangerous neighborhood. If I suddenly rolled up to the curb in a high-end Mercedes sedan flanked by massive, armed bodyguards, my predatory landlord would immediately triple my rent. My neighbors would target me, and I wouldn't be able to leave quietly. I insisted that I needed to pack my clothes, pay what I owed, and slip away into the night without causing a massive scene. Dante's jaw clenched so hard I could hear the bone grind, his dark eyes turning dangerously cold as he stepped into my space, stating with absolute, non-negotiable authority that he would never allow me to walk alone into a dangerous neighborhood where ruthless men were actively looking to collect a $3 million debt from anyone associated with Derek. We stood there in the quiet study, our wills violently clashing like an immovable force, meeting an unstoppable object, his deep need to control and protect versus my hard-earned, desperate need for independence. Finally, realizing that he would simply lock the front doors before letting me leave unprotected. I compromised, stating that the security must wear plain clothes, blend in completely, and look entirely unexceptional. Dante immediately pulled out his phone, fired off a rapid text message, and informed me that a man named Luca would accompany me. Luca was a former military operative, spoke flawless English, and possessed an expert knowledge of how to remain entirely invisible in hostile environments. And he would act as a friend, helping me move my boxes. I whispered a quiet thank you, but Dante stepped closer, his thumb grazing my cheekbone as he told me never to thank him for keeping me safe, stating with a low, intense gravity that protection wasn't something I should have to feel grateful for. It was the absolute bare minimum of what a woman like me deserved. He reminded me that when I returned, we would need to sit down and properly discuss every detail of Derek's life, his habits, and where our lives intersected to ensure his lethal problems never became mine. He warned me that while Derek didn't know I was here yet, he would inevitably come looking for me eventually just to salvage his bruised ego. And he made me promise with absolute intensity that I would inform him the literal second Derek ever tried to make contact. I gave him my promise, shivering as his thumb traced down my jawline, and he ordered me to be careful and come back safe, treating a simple packing trip like a high-stakes military operation because, as he softly murmured, everything was a military operation when you were protecting something truly precious. Luca turned out to be exactly the ghost Dante had promised. He was in his mid-30s, possessed an entirely average build, and wore a faded pair of jeans and an oversized hoodie that made him look like every single guy living on my block. The only detail that betrayed his true nature was his eyes. They were the cold, calculating eyes of a seasoned soldier, constantly scanning the horizon, cataloging potential threats, and mapping out multiple escape routes before we even left the garage. We bypassed the luxury fleet and took a completely unmarked, faded sedan that blended perfectly into the morning traffic. Luca drove with an easy, casual competence, asking sharp, specific questions about the layout of my building, the temperaments of my neighbors, and any potential structural complications we might face. By the time he smoothly pulled the car up to the cracked curb outside my rundown building, he likely understood the geography of my home better than I did. As we began to climb the narrow, echoing concrete stairwell, Luca quietly informed me that he would help me carry the boxes, but insisted on remaining completely visible, telling me that if anyone asked, he was simply my cousin helping me move out. I looked at his calm profile, my voice thick with anxiety as I asked if he spent a lot of time babysitting women for Dante. A tiny, rare smirk flickered across Luca's lips as he revealed that he had worked for Mr. Salvatore for 8 long years. And this was the absolute first time the boss had ever assigned him to protect someone like me. Usually, his assignments involved cutthroat business associates, high-level foreign dignitaries, and dangerous people belonging entirely to their world. When I remarked that I must be an anomaly, Luca stopped on the landing, looking at me with a profound seriousness as he stated that I was something Dante actually cared about, which made me infinitely more important to the family than diplomats and corporate businessmen combined. He paused outside my chipped wooden door, adding in a low whisper that Dante had been entirely different since the moment he met me, distracted, unsettled, and almost human. I had absolutely no idea what to do with that heavy piece of information. So I quickly unlocked the door and stepped into the apartment, my breath catching as the reality of my old life slammed into my chest. The studio looked drastically smaller than I remembered, appearing profoundly shabby, sad, and decayed in the harsh morning light. I stared at the yellowing water stains on the ceiling, the worn-out beige carpet, and the pathetic, mismatched collection of secondhand furniture I had painstakingly accumulated over years of struggle. This cramped space had been my pride, my tangible proof that I could survive entirely on my own without relying on anyone else. But now, after experiencing the absolute security and warmth of the Salvatore estate, this apartment no longer looked like independence. It looked like a pathetic cage I had spent 2 years pretending was freedom. I choked back a wave of emotion, my voice thick as I told Luca I would start packing in the bedroom area. And the process went incredibly fast, simply because I owned nothing of real value. I threw my worn clothes into a few cardboard boxes, packed a handful of paperbacks, and decided to leave the worthless furniture behind. The dishes in the sink were mismatched. Chipped charity shop finds that weren't worth the paper it would take to wrap them. The only object in the entire apartment that truly mattered to me was a small, battered wooden box of keepsakes that belonged to my mother, who had tragically passed away from a brutal, fast-moving cancer when I was only 16 years old. I was sitting on the floor, carefully wrapping her vintage jewelry box in sheets of old newspaper, when a sudden, heavy knock rattled the front door. My heart instantly stopped, freezing in my chest as Luca emerged from the kitchen with fluid, silent speed. His right hand moving instantly to the waistband of his jeans, where I now realized a heavy firearm was concealed. He motioned for me to stay back behind the divider wall, his face completely devoid of emotion as he opened the door a mere crack, using his broad shoulders to entirely block the entrance. He asked how he could help the visitor in a pleasant, completely unremarkable voice that sounded like an ordinary tenant. Then, a familiar voice drifted through the gap, a arrogant, demanding tone that made the blood in my veins turn to absolute ice. It was Derek, stating sharply that he was looking for Emma Carter. Luca glanced back at me through the crack, his eyes as asking the silent question, and I shook my head frantically, my hands clawing at my shirt as tears of pure panic threatened to spill. Luca turned back to the door without a single trace of hesitation, lying smoothly as he informed Derek that there was no one by that name living here, claiming that the previous tenant must have moved out and that the landlord had assured him the place was empty when he came to view it the day before. I heard Derek let out a loud, frustrated, arrogant sigh through the wood, grumbling that it was impossible because she had just been discharged from the hospital 3 days ago. But he ultimately muttered a curt thanks, and his heavy footsteps began to fade down the concrete hallway. Luca stood entirely frozen, waiting until the distant sound of the building's heavy fire door slamming shut echoed through the corridor before he finally closed and locked our door. My hands were shaking so violently, I dropped the newspaper, my voice a frantic whisper as I confirmed that the man was indeed my ex, demanding to know how he could have possibly tracked me down so quickly. Luca didn't share my panic. He pulled out his phone and began texting with rapid, military precision, calmly explaining that Derek didn't know I was here. He was merely checking my last known address on a desperate hunch, hoping to catch me home so he could force me into his demands. Lucas stuffed his phone back into his pocket and grabbed my suitcase and the heavy box containing my mother's diadem, stating with absolute authority that we needed to leave the building immediately. If Derek was desperate enough to show up here in broad daylight, there was a high probability he or the dangerous men hunting him were watching the street from a vehicle. I protested that I hadn't finished packing my things, but Luca ushered me firmly toward the door, cutting off my complaints by stating that it didn't matter anymore. Mr. Salvatore was already deploying a professional, covert team to pack every single remaining item in the apartment and place it into a secure, private storage facility under my name. Right now, his singular, non-negotiable directive was to extract me from the zone safely. We hurried down the stairwell and made it to the unmarked sedan without direct incident. But the entire walk across the concrete sidewalk felt suffocating. I could feel invisible eyes boring into the back of my neck, a thick sense of paranoia that I couldn't distinguish from genuine intuition. Luca tore away from the curb with practiced, casual speed, but the sudden, tight tension in his shoulders and his constant glances at the rearview mirror told me everything I needed to know. He informed me coldly that Mr. Salvatore wanted me back at the fortress immediately, adding with a grim expression that the boss was deeply concerned. And as I soon learned the moment we pulled through the massive iron gates of the estate, concerned was merely a polite code word for an absolute, terrifying fury. The car hadn't even come to a complete stop before Dante violently yanked my passenger door open, his large hands immediately slamming onto my shoulders as he pulled me out, his eyes frantically scanning my body, cataloging my limbs to ensure I was entirely intact. He demanded to know if I was hurt, his voice a low, dangerous rumble, and I quickly stammered that I was perfectly fine, explaining that Derek had shown up at the apartment, but Luca had handled the situation flawlessly. The moment Derek's name left my lips, Dante's entire demeanor went deadly, terrifyingly quiet, a chilling aura settling over him that made the guards around the driveway step back in unison. He repeated the words, his voice a whisper of pure malice as he noted that Derek had dared to show up at my home. He pulled me tightly against his massive chest, his arms banding around my waist with an intensity that nearly crushed the breath from my lungs, and through the thin fabric of his expensive shirt. I could feel his heart hammering against his ribs like a war drum. He muttered that this was exactly what he had been terrified of. Derek was circling like a vulture, looking for any shred of leverage he could find to save his own skin. And if he couldn't control me through the baby, he would try to exploit me for something else. I pulled back slightly, looking up into his hard, furious face as I demanded to know what earthly information I could possibly possess that would interest dangerous criminals. Dante gripped my shoulders tightly, his fingers digging into my skin as he pointed out that I had lived and worked alongside Derek for 3 long years and spent 18 months at that diner downtown. I knew his daily schedules, his secret habits, his financial associates, and every single location he fled to when he didn't want to be found. To the ruthless people he had stolen $3 million from. That information was worth more than gold, which made me an incredibly valuable asset and a prime target for a brutal interrogation. The sheer, unadulterated reality of my situation finally crashed over me like a tidal wave of Arctic ice water, shattering the last of my illusions. I wasn't just running from a toxic relationship or a messy breakup. I was actively running from a lethal criminal underworld where my knowledge could literally get me and my daughter killed. I looked at Dante, my eyes wide with a sudden, overwhelming terror, and whispered a broken question, asking him what I was supposed to do now. Dante's expression softened for a fraction of a second, his hands moving up to cup my face with that same intense, protective gentleness as he gave me the only answer that mattered, telling me to stay here, stay close, and let him handle the monsters. He tucked me firmly against his side, his arm a heavy, immovable shield around my shoulders as he guided me back toward the safety of the house, murmuring that Sophia was likely awake, starving, and that Maria had been pacing the floors with her for the past 20 minutes, waiting for her mother to return. The heavy wooden doors of the mansion clicked shut behind us, instantly sealing out the oppressive humidity of the morning and returning me to the cool, quiet safety of Dante's world. The sound of Sophia's sharp, frantic cries hit me before we even cleared the grand foyer, sending a bolt of pure maternal panic straight to my chest and making my milk ache. Maria appeared at the top of the grand staircase, her face etched with profound relief the moment her eyes locked onto mine. She hurried down the steps to hand over my red-faced, screaming daughter. She murmured that the poor angel knew her mama was gone, praising her as a smart little girl who couldn't be fooled by a bottle. The moment I gathered Sophia against my chest, her desperate cries crumbled into ragged whimpers, her tiny hands clawing at my shirt as she immediately began rooting for milk through the thin cotton of my pajamas. The sheer normalcy of the act, the simple, biological necessity of feeding my child, acted as an instant anchor, centering my chaotic thoughts amidst the swirling madness of the criminal underworld. Dante stood completely still a few feet away, watching the two of us with an expression I couldn't entirely decipher, a volatile, heavy mixture of hunger, intense longing, and an unyielding sense of possession that made the air between us feel thick and electric. He broke the silence by quietly stating that he would have my things brought up to the suite immediately, adding with a cold, absolute gravity that he was officially increasing the estate's security. He swore that absolutely no one would get near this property without his personal knowledge, explicitly naming Derek, his new girlfriend, and anyone associated with his family's prominent investment firm. I looked up from Sophia's shifting form, my voice tight as I argued that he couldn't just build a massive wall around us forever. But Dante stepped into my space, his large hands framing my face with an intensity that made it impossible to look away. He told me to watch him, reminding me with a low, gravelly reverence that I was officially his to protect now, which meant he would do whatever it took to keep us safe, even if that meant guards, walls, and ensuring Derek Morrison understood that touching me would be the absolute last mistake he ever made. When I whispered that his words sounded like a promise of execution, his thumb slow traced my lower lip as he predatory smiled, stating that it was exactly a threat, because he didn't make idle threats, and he never, ever lost what belonged to him. I pulled back slightly, my voice trembling as I insisted I wasn't his. But he merely murmured that it was just a matter of time before I stopped fighting what I already felt: the safety, the security, and the undeniable way my body responded to his proximity. He whispered that he could see all of me, a truth that terrified me far more than the ruthless loan sharks or the impending federal investigations, because every hour I spent in his fortress, I felt myself slipping deeper into Dante Salvatore's carefully constructed world. And the worst part was, I wasn't entirely sure I wanted to escape anymore. I deflected by murmuring that I needed to go feed Sophia, and he gently pressed a tender, possessive kiss to my forehead, claiming me completely as he told me to go, promising that we would have a private dinner tonight where he would uncover every deferred dream and buried hope I had ever hidden away. The afternoon crawled by in a quiet, isolated rhythm inside the blue suite. The heavy silence of the mansion only broken by the soft sounds of Sophia breathing as she slept soundly in her custom nursery. I took a long, hot shower in the magnificent bathroom, letting the high-pressure jets wash away the lingering grime of my old studio apartment and the terrifying adrenaline of our near miss with Derek. Afterward, I walked into the massive walk-in closet and selected a simple, emerald green silk robe that had appeared on the hangers, wrapping it tightly around my frame and tying the belt around my diminished waist. As the clock ticked closer to 8 o'clock, a familiar knot of anticipation tightened in my stomach. A strange, intoxicating blend of terror and desperate desire for the dinner Dante had promised. Windalow! A light knock finally rattled my door. I took a deep breath, checked on Sophia one last time to ensure she was resting peacefully under Maria's watchful eye, and opened it to find Dante standing in the corridor. He had changed into a crisp black button-down shirt and dark tailored slacks, looking effortlessly lethal, like sin personified, as he asked if I was ready for dinner. I swallowed down the voice in my head, screaming that I was walking straight into a beautiful trap, looked into his dark, intense eyes, and whispered that I was ready, fully aware that ready or not, I was already falling into his orbit, and Dante Salvatore was the exact kind of man who always caught what belonged to him. He led me down to the stone terrace once again, but tonight the atmosphere felt entirely different, shifting from a stiff, sterile business negotiation to an intense, suffocatingly intimate encounter. The massive banquet table from the previous evening had been replaced by a much smaller, circular wrought iron table, forcing our chairs into a tight, unavoidable proximity where our knees would occasionally brush in the darkness. Tall, elegant candles flickered between us, casting long, dramatic shadows across Dante's sharp features, transforming his face into something carved from cold, eternal marble beautiful. Dangerous! And entirely unyielding. He reached for the crystal decanters, pouring a rich, blood-red wine for himself and a sparkling, chilled water for me, before leaning back in his chair and cutting straight through the superficial pleasantries by asking me to tell him about my mother. I blinked at the unexpected question, freezing with my water glass halfway to my lips as I asked him why he could possibly care about that. Dante met my defensive gaze with an unsettling, calm steadiness, stating softly that he had observed how carefully and fiercely I had packed her few remaining things at the apartment, and noted that there was a deep, unyielding grief in my eyes whenever I thought no one was watching. He leaned forward, the warm candlelight illuminating the gold flecks in his dark eyes, as he murmured that he wanted to understand exactly what had shaped me into the resilient, stubborn woman sitting across from him. I took a slow sip of water to buy my racing heart some time, tracing patterns on the linen tablecloth as I finally opened up, telling him that she had died when I was only 16 from a fast. Brutal cancer. One ordinary day, she was complaining about standard headaches, and 6 grueling months later, she was completely gone, leaving me entirely alone in the world. When Dante quietly asked about my father, I let out a bitter, hollow laugh, stating that I had never known him. My mother always told me he was a monumental mistake she didn't regret simply because she got me out of the deal. I detailed the grim reality of my youth, explaining how I had entered the cold foster care system the day she died, aged out the second I turned 18, and worked back-to-breaking jobs to save every single penny for college. I met Derek during my sophomore year, and for a brief, foolish moment, I honestly thought I had finally figured out how to build something stable, safe, and permanent, and then he utterly destroyed it. Dante's knuckles went stark white around the stem of his wine glass, his jaw clenching with an intensity that looked lethal as I bitterly explained how Derek had convinced me to drop out of school, move into his apartment, and trust him to take care of everything, only to trade me in for a newer model with a massive trust fund the second I got pregnant. Dante set his glass down with an explosive, controlled click against the table, his eyes boring into mine with a terrifyingly calm gravity as he whispered that if I gave him the word, he could make Derek Morrison disappear permanently from the face of the earth. promising that no one would ever find him and no one would even look that hard. My breath caught violently in my throat, a shiver of genuine terror running down my spine as I realized he wasn't joking. He was completely, dead serious, stating coldly that he had killed men for far less than what Derek had done to my dignity. But he smoothed his features, his deep voice dropping into a low, velvet purr as he confessed that he was trying to be civilized for me, trying to be the exact kind of man I could eventually learn to care for. He promised that instead of making Derek disappear, he would settle for making him entirely irrelevant, ensuring the coward would never touch me or Sophia again, while he built a life so grand I would forget my ex ever existed. When I told him that his version of civilization was still terrifying, Dante leaned closer, his dark eyes locking onto mine as he murmured that I should be a little terrified of him because it would keep me honest, but swore that the violence he was capable of would never, ever be directed at me. He called me and Sophia sacred, untouchable, and the only soft things left in his entire brutal world. The question burst out of my chest before I could stop it. I demanded to know why us. Why me? Pointing out that a man of his staggering wealth and lethal power could have any beautiful, sophisticated woman he desired. Dante's hand shot across the small table, his large, warm fingers wrapping firmly around mine with an intensity that left me completely unable to pull away. He looked at me with a raw, piercing devotion, stating fiercely that he didn't want anyone else. From the exact second he saw me standing tall in that hospital hallway, exhausted, heartbroken, and still fighting for my daughter, he had wanted me. He bared his soul, telling me that when he looked at me, he saw incredible strength disguised as vulnerability, a woman who had been knocked down repeatedly by life but kept getting back up, asking for absolutely nothing in return. His grip tightened around my hand as his voice broke slightly, confessing that when I looked at Sophia, I looked at her with the exact kind of fierce, world-defying love his own mother used to have for him and his sister, a rare, precious love he had been desperately searching for ever since he lost his family. I looked at the heavy lines of pain etching his hard face, my voice softening as I brought up his sister, remembering his mention of her from the text messages. A flash of raw, completely unguarded agony flickered across Dante's features as he uttered her name, Isabella, revealing that she was only 17 when she made the fatal mistake of getting involved with a boy from a vicious rival crime family. Then the relationship went bad, and she found herself in deep trouble. She was too utterly terrified of Dante's violent world and potential anger to come to him for help, choosing instead to handle the crisis entirely alone. Dante's jaw worked furiously, his eyes darkening into pools of black malice as he explained that the boy turned brutally violent, using Isabella as sick leverage against the Salvatore family. By the time Dante finally uncovered the truth, it was catastrophically too late. She had been missing for 3 grueling days, and when they finally found her body, she had been subjected to horrors he couldn't even bring himself to articulate. I squeezed his massive hand tightly, tears of deep empathy burning behind my eyes as I whispered how sorry I was. But Dante's expression turned into something monstrous, a glimpse of the absolute devil lurking beneath his civilized surface, as he coldly stated that he had killed every single person involved in her death slowly, painfully, making sure they understood exactly what they had stolen from him. He looked back at me, his gaze burning through my defense as he explained that after her funeral, he swore a sacred oath that he would never let someone he cared about suffer in silence again, never fail to protect them when they needed him most. Understanding crashed over me like a violent wave, and I pulled my hand back, whispering that I was merely a second chance to fix his past guilt. But Dante stood up immediately, moving around the small table to pull me to my feet, his hands framing my face with an intense, burning heat. He swore I wasn't a replacement, and I was something entirely new, someone who had made him feel a spark of hope he thought had died a decade ago, proving to him that he could be something more than just endless violence and vengeance. He acknowledged that this was insanely fast and terrifying, but he begged me to stay, to let him prove he could be exactly what me and Sophia needed to build something real. When I brokenly asked what would happen if I simply couldn't give him what he wanted, he murmured with absolute devotion that he should still protect us, still provide for Sophia, and still carry Derek's burdens because he was falling deeply, irreversibly in love with me, with my pride, my stubbornness, my strength, and my refusal to drown. He stood there, his breath hot against my face, delivering the ultimate ultimatum. stating that he was falling and wasn't going to stop, leaving only the singular question of whether I would fall with him or run away into the night. Every logical shred of common sense I possessed told me to run, to grab my child and flee from this dangerous man's obsession. But instead, captivated by his raw honesty, I rose on my tiptoes and slammed my lips against his. It was an act of pure desperation, reckless and entirely inevitable. And Dante's powerful arms banded around me instantly, crushing me against his massive chest as he took complete, roaring control of the kiss, claiming and conquering me like a predator that had finally caught the prey it had been stalking through the shadows. The morning sun broke through the heavy, fortified glass of the master suite, painting the cream and blue walls in sharp streaks of amber light that did nothing to calm the storm raging inside my head. The raw, primal intensity of the kiss we had shared on the terrace still burned on my lips, a lingering mark of submission to an inevitability I had fought so hard to deny. I stood in the center of the expansive bedroom, listening to the soft, rhythmic breathing of Sophia sleeping in the adjoining nursery under Maria's impeccable care, realizing with absolute clarity that my old life was officially dead. The $5,000 was cashed, my landlord was paid, and my mismatched, tragic belongings were currently being packed by a covert extraction team I would never meet. I had bartered my presence, my loyalty, and my honesty for the absolute safety of my child. Yet, as I looked down at my hands, they were still shaking from the sheer velocity of the changes pulling me under. Dante had kept his promise. He had given me a sanctuary, a flawless foul die where the ruthless loan sharks and debt collectors hunting Derek couldn't touch us without initiating a bloodbath. But the sheer weight of his control, the suffocating reality of his protective cage, began to trigger the deeply ingrained survival mechanisms that had kept me alive in the slums for years. I couldn't just sit here as like a decorative porcelain doll, dressed in silk robes that didn't belong to me, waiting for a powerful man to dictate the parameters of my existence. I needed to move. I needed to feel the pavement beneath my feet, and I needed to face the remnants of my past one last time, to prove to myself that I hadn't completely vanished into the shadow of the Salvatore name. I stepped into the massive walk-in closet, stripping off the emerald robe and pulling on a pair of the soft, dark lounge pants and a nursing-friendly cotton top Dante had provided, determined to confront the immovable force waiting for me downstairs. I found Dante in the grand dining room, sitting at the head of a massive mahogany table that looked long enough to host a corporate board meeting. He was dressed in a tailored navy suit that molded perfectly to his broad shoulders, a stark contrast to the casual elegance of the previous night, proving that the businessman was once again operating the levers of his empire. He was reading through a stack of legal documents, a silver pen balanced precisely between his fingers. But the exact second my footsteps echoed on the marble threshold, his eyes snapped up, locking onto me with that familiar, laser-focused intensity that cataloged my expression within a heartbeat. He didn't offer a polite greeting. He simply stood up, gesturing to a spread of fresh fruit, pastries, and artisanal coffee that had been laid out for me, instructing me to sit and eat before my milk drained my strength. I ignored the chair, stepping closer to the table until only a few feet of polished wood separated us, my voice tight as I delivered my ultimatum, stating firmly that I appreciated the sanctuary he had built, but I was going back to my studio apartment today to finish sorting through the practical matters of my life. Dante's expression went instantly cold, the silver pen dropping against the wood with a sharp, echoing click as he stood at his full, imposing height, his jaw clenching with a lethal tightness that made the air in the room turn to ice. He stepped around the table, invading my personal space until I could feel the suffocating heat radiating off his body, his deep voice dropping into a dangerous, gravelly whisper as he reminded me that we had already established Derek was actively hunting for me, and that entering a notorious, unmonitored slum in broad daylight was an act of pure, unadulterated madness. I refused to back down, my stubborn pride flaring violently as I locked my gaze with his, arguing fiercely that I had lived in that bad neighborhood for 2 long years without his army of guards and had managed to survive every single day. I explained that I needed to physically pack the boxes myself, pay the remaining utility balances, and hand the keys directly to the landlord to ensure there were no legal ties or paper trails left connecting me to that address. I looked him dead in the eyes, my voice trembling but unyielding as I told him that if this arrangement was truly a partnership and not a beautiful captivity, He had to respect my need for independence and allow me to handle my own closure. The silence that followed was a brutal clash of wills, an immovable force violently meeting an unstoppable object as Dante's dark eyes burned into mine, searching for any sign of weakness or hesitation in my posture. He stepped even closer, his chest almost brushing against mine as his large hands came up to frame my face, his thumbs stroking my cheekbones with an intensity that felt more like a warning than a caress. He whispered fiercely that my independence would get me killed in a world where ruthless men were currently dissecting Derek S. life for leverage, stating coldly that to the people hunting my ex, I wasn't a fierce, independent woman, I was a walking, breathing map of his vulnerabilities. But as he looked at the defiance blazing in my eyes, he let out a long, frustrated growl, his shoulders shifting as he finally yielded a fraction of an inch, acknowledging that he could not break my spirit without destroying the very quality that made him fall for me in that hospital hallway. He pulled out his phone, firing off a rapid text message before looking back down at me, delivering his final, non-negotiable compromise, stating that I could go to the apartment. But I would not go alone. A man named Luca would accompany me in plain clothes, acting as a cousin helping me move. And the moment he sensed even a whisper of danger, the extraction would be immediate and absolute. 30 minutes later, I was sitting in the passenger seat of a completely unremarkable, slightly faded sedan, watching the massive iron gates of the Salvatore estate disappear in the rearview mirror as Luca navigated the winding mountain roads. Luca was the exact ghost Dante had promised, dressed in a worn hoodie and a pair of faded jeans. He looked like every single guy who had ever waited tables or worked a shift at the docks in my old neighborhood. But as I watched his hands grip the steering wheel, I noticed the heavy, calloused ridges on his knuckles and the way his eyes never stopped moving, constantly scanning the mirrors, mapping out the distance between vehicles, and checking the blind spots with a chilling, military precision. The silence inside the vehicle was thick, heavy with the lingering tension of my argument with Dante, until I finally turned to Luca and asked how long he had been acting as a shadow for the Salvatore family. A tiny, almost imperceptible smirk flickered across his lips as he replied that he had spent 8 years handling security for the boss, but confessed that this was the absolute first time he had ever been deployed to protect a woman who wasn't part of the syndicate. He explained that usually his assignments involved tracking rival bosses, securing international business deals, or extracting high-level assets from hostile territories, which made this assignment a fascinating anomaly. But I remarked bitterly that Dante was simply obsessed with controlling everything in his orbit. Luca shook his head slowly, his expression turning profoundly serious as he told me I was entirely wrong. He stated with quiet gravity that Dante hadn't slept a single hour since he brought me to the house, revealing that the boss had spent the entire night pacing the corridors and monitoring the security feeds outside my door, completely distracted and unsettled by a vulnerability he had never experienced before. Luca looked at me through the mirror, his voice a low whisper as he added that for 8 years, Dante Salvatore had been a machine of pure logic and calculated violence. But the moment he looked at me and Sophia in that hospital, he became something entirely different, almost human. The weight of Luca's words sat heavily in my chest as the fadeds finally drifted into the concrete grid of the city center, the pristine estates giving way to crumbling brick facades, chain-link fences, and the pervasive, heavy smell of exhaust and poverty. We pulled up to the curb outside my rundown apartment building, the tires crunching against broken glass and discarded wrappers. And the sudden familiarity of the space made my stomach twist into a tight knot of anxiety. I looked up at the water-stained brick exterior, realizing with a pang of clarity that only 48 hours ago, this place had been my entire world, the sanctuary I had fought so hard to maintain after my mother died. Now it looked like a decaying tomb, fragile shelter that would have easily crumpled the moment the wolves of Derek's world came knocking on the door. Luca turned off the engine, his entire demeanor shifting instantly into a state of hypervigilance as his hand brushed casually against the waistband of his jeans, ensuring the heavy firearm concealed beneath his hoodie was clear for a rapid draw. He looked at me, his voice calm and entirely unremarkable, as he instructed me to stay close behind him on the stairwell, reminding me that to anyone who asked. He was simply my cousin helping me pack the last of my boxes. We climbed the narrow, echoing concrete steps in silence, the faint sounds of shouting neighbors and clinking dishes drifting through the thin apartment doors. until we finally reached the third floor. I unlocked the heavy metal door, stepping into the dusty, stale air of my studio apartment, and felt a sudden wave of suffocating emotion pull at my throat as the morning light illuminated the sheer shabbiness of the space I had once callously called freedom. Packing went incredibly fast, simply because my life had been reduced to a few scattered fragments of survival. Luca moved with an efficient, quiet speed, assembling cardboard boxes and wrapping my mismatched charity shop dishes in sheets of old newspaper without uttering a single complaint. I walked into the small bedroom alcove, my hands trembling as I reached for the only object that truly mattered in the entire world, the battered wooden keepsake box that contained the last remaining diadem of my mother's life. I sat on the edge of the mattress, carefully polishing the vintage jewelry case with the hem of my shirt, lost in the crushing memory of her final days in that brutal hospice ward. When a sudden, heavy, synchronized pounding rattled the front door of the apartment, my heart violently stopped in my chest, the blood in my veins turning to absolute ice as Luca materialized from the kitchen area with fluid. Terrifying speed. His hand instantly clamping around the grip of the weapon at his waist as he pushed me back behind the drywall divider. He placed a single finger against his lips, his eyes turning into chips of cold flint as he crept toward the door, peeking through the warped peephole before turning back to me with a grim expression that confirmed my worst nightmare. He mouthed the name Derek. The pounding came again, louder this time, accompanied by a frantic, arrogant shout that made my skin crawl as my ex demanded that I open the door because he knew I was inside. Luca didn't hesitate. He opened the door a mere fraction of an inch, using his broad, muscular frame to entirely block the view of the apartment as he adopted a pleasant, completely unremarkable tenant voice, asking Derek what he wanted. Through the narrow gap in the door, I could hear Derek's breath coming in ragged, frantic gasps, his usual polished arrogance replaced by a volatile, trembling desperation that made him sound like a cornered animal. He snapped at Luca, demanding to know who the hell he was and where Emma Carter was hiding, claiming that this was her apartment, and she had just been discharged from the hospital 3 days ago. Luca didn't flinch. He lied with a smooth, completely unbothered competence that made my jaw drop, calmly informing Derek that the landlord had cleared the apartment out 2 days ago and that he had just signed the lease yesterday morning. He told Derek that he had no idea who Emma Carter was, suggesting with a bored shrug that perhaps she had skipped out on the rent or moved back to her family's place, and advising him to check with the main leasing office down the block. I nuzzled myself against the drywall, my fingers clawing at the wallpaper as I listened to Derek let out a loud, furious curse, slamming his fist against the doorframe in sheer frustration as he muttered that she couldn't have just vanished into thin air. He grumbled a bitter apology to Luca, his heavy leather shoes squeaking loudly against the linoleum as his footsteps rapidly retreated down the hallway, the distant slam of the Building S heavy iron fire door finally signaling that the immediate threat had passed. Luca didn't move for 2 full minutes, standing frozen at the door with his ear pressed to the wood, ensuring there were no lingering shadows in the corridor before he finally closed the lock and turned back to me, his face tight with military urgency as he grabbed my suitcase and my mother's keepsake box, stating coldly that the extraction was happening right now. We sprinted down the narrow stairwell, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird as Luca kept his body positioned entirely in front of mine, his eyes scanning every landing and every open window with lethal focus. We burst through the front exit of the building and made it to the faded sedan without direct incident. But the entire walk across the concrete sidewalk felt suffocating. I could feel invisible eyes boring into the back of my neck from every parked car and every decaying alleyway, a heavy shroud of paranoia that I could no longer distinguish from genuine survival intuition. Luca tore away from the curb with a screech of tires, throwing the car into the chaotic city traffic with a practiced, aggressive speed that matched the sudden, rigid tension in his broad shoulders. He pulled out his phone, firing off a series of encrypted voice commands in rapid Italian, before turning to me with a grim expression, informing me that Mr. Salvatore had already been notified of Derek's appearance and had ordered an immediate security lockdown of the entire city sector. He explained that a specialized, heavily armed cleanup crew was already moving into my old building to completely sanitize the space and erase any lingering trace of my residency, ensuring that when the debt collectors inevitably returned to question the landlord, they would find an absolute dead end. As the faded sedan raced back toward the safety of the rolling hills, the sheer, unadulterated reality of my situation finally crashed over me like a tidal wave of Arctic water, completely shattering the last of my foolish illusions about independence. I wasn't just a girl who had made a bad choice in a partner or a waitress trying to recover from a difficult delivery. I was actively entangled in a high stakes, lethal criminal underworld where my past knowledge made me a prime target for execution. And my only shield against total annihilation was the powerful, obsessed mafia boss waiting for me in that stone fortress. The moment the faded sedan cleared the massive iron gates of the Salvatore estate, the car hadn't even come to a complete stop before Dante violently yanked my passenger door open, his large hand slamming onto my shoulders with a terrifying, protective fury that nearly lifted me from the leather seat. He pulled me out into the blinding midday sun, his dark eyes frantic and bloodshot as they swept across my face, my throat, and my limbs, cataloging every inch of my body to ensure I was entirely intact and uninjured. He demanded to know if the bastard had touched me, his deep voice vibrating with a primal, monstrous malice that made the guards stationed around the driveway instantly step back in unison, their eyes downcast out of sheer respect for his anger. I quickly wrapped my arms around his neck, my face burying into the expensive fabric of his navy suit jacket as I whispered that I was perfectly fine, explaining that Derek had only spoken to Luca through the door and had no idea I was hiding inside the apartment. Dante's arms banded around my waist with an intensity that nearly crushed the breath from my lungs, his heart hammering against my chest like a war drum as he held me against his massive frame, his entire body trembling with the lingering adrenaline of a man who had almost lost the only thing that kept him tethered to his humanity. He muttered into my hair that this was exactly the nightmare he had been trying to prevent, explaining that Derek was circling like a starving vulture, looking for any shred of leverage he could exploit to save himself from the executioners, and warning me with absolute gravity that our trial basis was officially over from this second forward. My presence in his foul die was an absolute, non-negotiable necessity for the survival of our daughter. He guided me back into the cool, silent sanctuary of the mansion, his heavy arm remaining clamped around my shoulders like an immovable shield as he ushered me down the hallway toward his private study, where Maria was already waiting with a freshly fed, soundly sleeping Sophia. The sight of my daughter resting peacefully in her designer bassinet acted as an instant balm to the terror raging in my chest. The contrast between the violent chaos of the slums and the absolute luxury of this room hitting me with a profound, undeniable clarity. Dante closed the heavy mahogany doors behind us, shutting out the rest of the world as he walked over to his massive desk, his face settling into a cold, calculating mask of pure strategy as he looked back at me, his eyes burning with an unyielding determination. He stated with quiet authority that it was time to strip away every single secret left between us, demanding that I sit down and detail every toy Quinn, every financial associate, and every hidden location Derek had ever mentioned during our 3 years together. He explained that this information was no longer a matter of corporate fraud. It was the ultimate weapon he would use to systematically dismantle Derek's leverage and ensure the federal authorities crushed the coward before the syndicate could turn their sights on us. I looked at him, realizing with a shiver of genuine anticipation that I was no longer fighting against his world, I was actively stepping into it, trusting the dangerous predator who had claimed my child to hunt down the monsters threatening our future, fully prepared to give him the absolute loyalty he required to keep us alive. The drive back from the city center felt like a descent into an entirely different reality. The transition from the decaying asphalt of my old life to the flawless, winding mountain roads of the Salvatore estate happening in a tense, claustrophobic silence. Luca's eyes never stopped darting to the rearview mirror, his knuckles white against the steering wheel as he subtly monitored the road behind us, checking for any phantom trailing vehicle that might have picked up our scent from the alleyways. I clutched my mother's battered keepsake box against my chest like a shield, the cold wood pressing into my ribs as I tried to process the terrifying speed at which my existence had just fractured 48 hours ago. I was a nameless, penniless mother shivering in a yellow-green maternity ward, terrified of how I would buy the next can of formula. Now, I was riding in an armored phantom vehicle, returning to a sprawling glass and steel foul die because a powerful, obsessed man had decided that my daughter and I belonged under his wing. and that the past 3 years of my life had unwittingly turned me into a high-value target for international debt collectors. The massive iron gates of the estate loomed ahead, swinging open with a heavy, hydraulic groan that sounded less like an invitation and more like the definitive slamming shut of a heavy iron vault. The car had barely settled into park on the stone driveway before Dante yanked my passenger door open, his presence so massive and overwhelming it entirely eclipsed the midday sun. His large hands clamped onto my shoulders with a terrifying, bruising intensity, pulling me out into the open air as his gold-flecked eyes frantically scanned my face, my throat, and my limbs, desperate to confirm that I hadn't been returned to him, broken or bleeding. He demanded to know if Derek had laid a finger on me, his deep, resonant voice vibrating with a monstrous, gravelly malice that caused the armed guards standing along the perimeter to instantly drop their gazes out of sheer deference to his fury. I quickly pressed my palms against his crisp navy suit jacket, feeling the terrifying, erratic hammer of his heart beneath the high-priced fabric as I whispered that I was perfectly fine, explaining that Derek had only spoken to Luca through the closed door and had absolutely no idea I was hiding in the shadows inside the apartment. Dante's arms banded around my waist with a crushing force that nearly drove the oxygens from my lungs, pulling me flush against his immense frame as he buried his face into the crook of my neck, his entire body trembling slightly with the lingering adrenaline of a man who had briefly stared into the abyss of losing his only connection to humanity. He muttered into my skin that this was exactly the nightmare he had been trying to prevent, explaining with a chilling gravity that Derek was circling like a starving predator, hunting for any shred of information or leverage he could exploit to pacify the executioners chasing his $3 million fraud, and warning me that our trial basis was officially a thing of the past from this second forward. My presence behind these walls was an absolute, non-negotiable necessity for the survival of our child. He guided me back into the cool, quiet sanctuary of the mansion, his heavy, possessive arm remaining locked around my shoulders like an unyielding shield as he ushered me down the grand marble hallway toward his private, wood-paneled study. Maria was already waiting inside, gently rocking a freshly fed, soundly sleeping Sophia in her arms, her deeply lined face smoothing out with a wave of intense relief the moment she saw us cross the threshold intact. The sheer normalcy of my daughter's quiet breathing acted as an instant anchor against the panic clawing at my throat. The sharp contrast between the decaying, water-stained walls of the studio apartment and the absolute luxury of this room hitting me with undeniable clarity. I took Sophia from Maria's arms, holding her tiny, perfect body against my chest as she let out a soft, milk-drunk sigh, her small fingers curling into a fist against my shirt. Dante watched the two of us from across the room, his expression a volatile, dark cocktail of hunger, protective longing, and absolute possession that made the air between us feel incredibly thick and electric. He broke the silence by quietly stating that he had already commanded a specialized covert team to pack every single remaining piece of my history from that apartment and transfer it to a secure facility, ensuring that when Derek or his creditors inevitably returned, they would find an absolute dead end. He stepped closer, his shadow falling over us as he looked down at my face, his voice dropping into a low, gravelly rumble that left no room for argument or defiance. He told me it was time to strip away every single secret left between us, demanding that I sit down at his desk and detail every habit, every financial associate, and every hidden location Derek had ever mentioned during our 3 years together. He explained with cold calculation that this information was no longer a matter of checking up on an unfaithful ex. It was the ultimate weapon he would use to systematically dismantle Derek's leverage, ensuring the federal authorities crushed the coward before the rival syndicate could turn their sights on the woman holding his secrets. I looked up into his dangerous, unyielding eyes, feeling the last remnants of my stubborn independence slipping away, and realized that I was no longer fighting against his terrifying world. I was actively stepping into it, trusting the very predator who had claimed my child to hunt down the monsters threatening our future. The hours that followed inside the quiet study felt like a slow, meticulous dissection of my past. Each name and memory I dragged to the surface being cataloged by Dante with a chilling, strategic focus. I sat in the heavy leather chair, the scent of aged wood and expensive tobacco wrapping around me as I detailed the grueling reality of my 3 years with Derek, his late-night meetings with obscure investors, the sudden influx of unexplained wealth, and the specific names of the offshore shells he boasted about when he was drunk on his father's premium scotch. Dante stood by the towering glass window, his silver pen balancing precisely between his long fingers as he listened without interrupting. His sharp profile looking as cold and permanent as something carved from Roman marble under the shifting afternoon light. Every time a name left my lips, he would fire off a rapid, encrypted text message or issue a low, lethal directive in rapid Italian to someone on the other end of his secure line. The machinery of his vast empire shifting instantly to hunt down the threads I was providing. When the grueling interrogation was finally complete, the sun had fully dipped below the horizon, painting the vast grounds outside in brutal shades of crimson and bruised purple, casting long, ominous shadows across the polished mahogany of his desk. Dante walked over to my chair, his immense frame blocking out the rest of the room as he reached down, his large, warm hands gently pulling me to my feet with an effortless strength that left me breathless. He framed my face with his palms, his thumbs tracing my cheekbones with a tenderness that completely contradicted the monstrous violence I knew he was executing in the shadows. He murmured that I had done perfectly, promising with an absolute, terrifying certainty that by the time the federal authorities were finished with the evidence he was routing through the system, Derek Morrison would become a completely irrelevant memory, locked away in a cage where he could never threaten the sanctity of our family again. I leaned my forehead against his chest, listening to the steady, powerful rhythm of his heart, and whispered that his version of protection felt like a beautiful trap. Dante let out a low, ragged laugh, his arms banding tightly around my waist as he pulled me into his warmth, his voice dropping into a velvet purr that vibrated straight through my bones as he whispered that it wasn't a trap, but a foundation leaving only the singular question of whether I was ready to stop fighting the current and let him carry the full weight of my storm. The heavy mahogany door of the study clicked shut behind me, the sound echoing like a definitive gavel in the quiet hallway. I stood there for a long moment, my arms wrapped tightly around my waist, trying to steady the frantic rhythm of my breathing. The sheer weight of the information I had just handed over to Dante felt like a physical burden lifted from my chest. Yet it left a cold, hollow space in its wake. I walked slowly up the grand marble staircase, my feet sinking into the plush runner, heading toward the quiet sanctuary of the Blue Suite where my daughter awaited. When I pushed open the door to the nursery, the soft glow of the nightlight washed over the room, casting gentle shadows across the hand-painted murals. Sophia was fast asleep in her designer bassinet, her tiny chest rising and falling in perfect, peaceful rhythm. Completely oblivious to the storm her mother was navigating just floors below, Maria sat in the wooden rocking chair, a knitted blanket draped over her lap, her kind face softening into a warm smile as I approached. She stood up with practiced, silent grace, squeezing my forearm gently as she whispered that the little angel had slept beautifully through the evening before slipping out of the room to grant us privacy. I sank into the chair she had vacated, pulling my knees up to my chest and resting my chin on my arms, my eyes fixed entirely on my daughter's perfect, sleeping face. The quiet of the nursery allowed the chilling reality of Dante's warnings to truly sink in. For 3 years, I had believed I was simply trapped in a toxic, failing relationship with a selfish man who valued corporate ambition over human connection. Now, I had to accept that I had been sharing a bed with a federal target, a man whose desperate greed had entangled our lives with a ruthless criminal syndicate that viewed us as nothing more than leverage. The realization made me shiver despite the warm, climate-controlled air of the fortress. I wasn't just hiding from a broken heart. I was hiding from consequences that could get us killed. Dante's voice echoed in my mind, his gravelly promise to make Derek irrelevant ringing with a terrifyingly calm authority that I could no longer dismiss as mere bravado. He was a man who moved mountains to build an entire custom nursery in 48 hours, just to accommodate a child that wasn't even his. A man who commanded an army of silent, lethal guards to shield us from the shadows. As I sat there in the darkness, the lingering heat of his touch on my jawline still burned on my skin, a silent testament to the undeniable, dangerous connection pulling me deeper into his orbit. I was a girl who had spent her entire life fighting alone on the cracked concrete of the city slums. But as I looked around this magnificent, secure sanctuary, I realized with a sudden wave of vulnerability that the hardest battle I had left to fight was against my own desire to surrender completely to Dante Salvatore's protection. The hours bled into the deep, silent hours of the night as I remained anchored to the rocking chair, listening to the soft murmur of the wind against the fortified glass windows. Sophia woke twice to feed. Her small, warm body pressed against my chest, acting as a powerful reminder of why I had agreed to step into this gilded cage. The simple biology of nursing her, the quiet rhythm of her tiny jaws moving, centered my chaotic thoughts and stripped away the terror of the underworld, leaving only the fierce, unyielding mandate of a mother's love. Around 4 in the morning, after burping her gently and laying her back down into the pristine cotton sheets, a sudden restlessness took hold of me. I wrapped the emerald green silk robe tightly around my frame, tying the belt securely around my waist, and quietly stepped out of the suite, my bare feet making no sound against the polished wood corridors. The mansion was wrapped in a heavy, watchful silence, the dim amber accent lights illuminating the vast hallways like a museum after hours. I drifted aimlessly through the labyrinthine layout, drawn by a faint, warm light glowing from the end of the western wing. As I approached the threshold, I realized it was Dante's private library, a massive 2-story room lined with thousands of leather-bound volumes and heavy velvet drapes. Dante was sitting in a large leather armchair near the stone fireplace, the embers dying down into a deep crimson glow that illuminated the sharp, uncompromising angles of his profile. He had unbuttoned the collar of his black silk shirt, his dark hair slightly rumpled as if he had been running his fingers through it for hours, looking entirely exhausted but retaining that dangerous, predatory elegance that never truly left him. A half-empty glass of amber scotch sat on the small table beside him, but his attention was entirely fixed on a series of financial ledgers spread across his lap, his silver pen balancing precisely between his long fingers. I leaned against the doorframe, watching him in the shadows, realizing with a sudden pang of clarity that Luca had been completely right. This man hadn't slept a single hour since the moment our paths crossed in that hospital corridor. Dante didn't turn his head, his pen tracing a line across the heavy paper, but his deep, gravelly voice broke the silence, murmuring for me to come inside and warm myself by the fire instead of lurking in the dark. I stepped into the room, the scent of aged paper, leather, and his expensive cologne wrapping around me instantly, and walked over to the hearth, rubbing my cold hands together as I watched the embers. Dante closed the ledger with a soft thunk, setting it aside before turning his gold-flecked eyes up to lock onto my face, his gaze cataloging the dark circles beneath my eyes with an intense, protective concern. He demanded to know if Sophia was sleeping well, his voice dropping into a low, resonant purr that vibrated straight to my bones, and I nodded quietly, whispering that she was resting like an angel. I turned my back to the fire, looking down at his massive frame, and asked him why he was still awake, pointing out that he had an entire army to fight his battles while he rested. Dante let out a low, ragged laugh, reaching out to take my hand and pulling me gently down until I was forced to sit on the wide velvet ottoman right in front of his chair, our knees brushing in the dim light. He cupped my face with his large, warm palms, his thumbs tracing my cheekbones with a tenderness that completely melted the defensive frost around my heart, and confessed that he couldn't sleep because the reality of having me beneath his roof was still too loud in his head. He looked at me with a raw, piercing intensity, stating fiercely that for 10 years, his mind had been a machine dedicated entirely to calculated strategy, corporate warfare, and the brutal preservation of his family's empire. But the moment he saw me holding my daughter against the cruelty of that hospital hallway, the machinery had completely jammed. He explained that my presence in his home was a vulnerability he had never prepared for, a soft, sacred light in a world of absolute darkness, and swore that he spent the night monitoring the perimeter feeds himself because the thought of those wolves catching even a glimpse of my shadow made his blood burn with a monstrous malice. Tears gathered in my eyes as I looked at the fierce devotion etching his hard features, my voice a broken whisper as I confessed that I was terrified of how easily I was slipping into his world, fearing that I was losing my independence to a beautiful captivity. Dante leaned forward, pressing his forehead against mine until our breaths mingled in the quiet library, and swore that he didn't want a captive or a trophy. He wanted a partner who was strong enough to bend without breaking, promising with absolute certainty that he would use every favored connection, every legal weapon, and every shred of his immense power to build a fortress so secure that my past mistakes would never reach us again, leaving me completely undone as his lips claimed mine in a slow, deep kiss of total possession. The morning sun rose higher over the Salvatore estate, casting long, sharp shadows across the manicured gardens. But inside the master wing, a heavy, contemplative stillness remained. I stood near the tall arched windows of my private sitting room, watching a pair of armed guards walk their perimeter route along the distant stone walls. The memory of Dante's lips on mine in the dim light of the library still hummed beneath my skin, a quiet vibration that felt less like a choice and more like a definitive surrender to the current pulling me under. I turned back to the room, adjusting the sash of the emerald silk robe around my waist, my eyes drifting to the doorway of the nursery where Maria was quietly folding a fresh stack of infant clothes. The frantic, chaotic rhythm of the city slums felt worlds away from this marble sanctuary. Yet the sudden safety didn't erase the deep, protective instinct that kept my shoulders tense. I walked into the nursery, stepping softly so as to not disturb Sophia as she slept soundly in her designer bassinet. Her tiny fingers curled tightly into a fist beneath her blanket. Maria looked up, her kind face breaking into a warm, understanding smile as she placed the last folded onesie into the drawer. She stepped closer, her voice dropping into a gentle whisper as she told me that the little angel's breathing was perfectly steady, reassuring me that I could leave the room for a few moments to clear my head without worrying. I squeezed her hand in silent gratitude, stepping out of the suite and heading down the grand staircase, drawn by the quiet necessity of facing the man who was systematically rewriting the parameters of my existence. I found Dante in the formal dining room, standing by the dark mahogany sideboard as he poured a fresh cup of black coffee. He had already changed into a tailored charcoal suit that accentuated the massive, imposing breadth of his shoulders, the crisp white collar of his shirt contrasting sharply with the tan skin of his throat. The exhaustion from his sleepless night was entirely masked beneath a cold, calculating layer of professional focus, the absolute authority of a billionaire businessman radiating off him with every fluid movement. The second my bare feet crossed the marble threshold, his eyes snapped toward me, those dark, gold-flecked depths locking onto my face with an intensity that missed absolutely nothing. He didn't offer a hollow greeting. Instead, he set his porcelain cup down with a soft click and pulled out the heavy wrought iron chair directly to his right, commanding me gently to sit down and eat the breakfast Maria had prepared. I walked over, the silk of my robe brushing against my legs, and took the seat, watching as he sat down beside me, his large, warm hand immediately settling over mine on the linen tablecloth with a possessive firmness that left no room for retreat. He murmured that his technical teams had spent the early morning hours completely dissecting the financial records and names I had provided in the study, revealing that the digital trail Derek left behind was far more substantial than my XS fragile intelligence could have ever generated on its own. Dante leaned closer, the scent of his expensive cologne and the rich aroma of coffee wrapping around me, as he explained the strategic reality of the situation. He stated calmly that the evidence of Derek's $3 million fraud was currently being routed through an anonymous, unassailable channel straight to the desk of a senior federal prosecutor downtown. He clarified that by utilizing the legal system to dismantle Derek, he was entirely eliminating the threat without triggering a messy, public turf war with the rival syndicate that was actively hunting my ex for leverage. He looked down at our joined hands, his thumb slow tracing the ridge of my knuckles as his voice dropped into a low, gravelly whisper, telling me that within a matter of weeks, Derek Morrison would find himself locked behind federal bars, stripped of his assets, his Porsche, and his freedom. When I whispered a question, asking if he was truly doing all of this just to shield a woman he had met in a hospital corridor, Dante's grip tightened around my fingers with a fierce, burning intensity. He bared his soul to me in the quiet room, confessing that 10 years ago, he had watched his family crumble because his 17-year-old sister, Isabella, had been too utterly terrified of his violent world to ask him for help when a rival family targeted her. He stated with a raw, agonizing devotion that when he looked at me holding Sophia against the cruelty of that maternity ward, he saw the exact same world-defying strength his mother possessed, and swore that he was executing this operation not out of guilt, but because he was irreversibly, profoundly in love with the woman I was. Tears gathered in my eyes. burning fiercely against my eyelids as I listened to the raw honesty vibrating through his gravelly voice. I looked at the small, pale scar running through his left eyebrow, realizing with a wave of deep vulnerability that this dangerous, predatory man was offering me a devotion so absolute it terrified me far more than the monsters lurking in the city slums. I whispered that his love felt like an immense storm that would eventually swallow my identity whole. But Dante merely rose from his chair, pulling me to my feet and framing my face with his massive, warm palms. He pressed his forehead against mine, his thumbs stroking my cheekbones with an exquisite gentleness, as he swore that he didn't want to conquer or change me. He wanted to stand as an unbreakable wall between my past and our daughter's future. He murmured that a true partnership in his world meant bending together without ever breaking, leaving me entirely breathless as his lips claimed mine in a slow, deep kiss of total, unyielding possession that effectively silenced the last remaining doubts in my mind. The golden morning sun of early November crept quietly through the arched windows of the master wing, illuminating the peaceful expanse of the blue suite. 6 weeks had dissolved into a smooth, transformative rhythm within the stone fortress. A period where the jagged terror of my past had gradually been blunted by an unyielding blanket of protection and care. I stood near the dark mahogany dresser in the nursery, watching Sophia sleep soundly in her custom bassinet. She had grown beautifully in the short time since our escape from the city slums, her cheeks plumping out and her tiny features sharpening into an expression of pure, quiet determination. She was safe, deeply loved, and entirely insulated from the cruelty of the world outside. The faint rustle of silk fabric signaled Dante's approach before I even felt his warmth. His large, strong arm slid effortlessly around my waist from behind, pulling my back firmly flush against the broad, solid expanse of his chest. I leaned back into his immense embrace, without a single shred of the hesitation or fear that had once dictated my every movement, my hands resting over his as we shared a quiet, synchronized moment of devotion toward the child sleeping before us. He murmured into my hair that she was perfect, his deep voice carrying a soft, rare reverence that he only ever exposed within the locked confines of this wing. I whispered my agreement, turning slowly within his arms to loop my hands behind his neck, looking up into those intense, gold-flecked eyes that had once held me frozen like a rabbit in headlights, but now felt like my only true anchor. Over the past month and a half, Dante had been profoundly patient, allowing me to dictate the fragile pace of our shifting relationship. We had shared intimate dinners on the terrace every single night he was home, talking for hours about the wreckage of our pasts and the clean slate of our future. He had gotten up with Sophia during the grueling hours of the night when she cried, applying the same fierce, razor-sharp focus to mastering the mechanics of changing diapers that he utilized to orchestrate multi-million-dollar international business maneuvers. He had held me without judgment when the volatile cocktail of exhaustion and postpartum hormones made me weep in the darkness, never once letting me feel weak for struggling to find my footing. Inevitably, hopelessly, I had fallen deeply in love with him, not despite the dangerous, lethal aura that wrapped around his name, but precisely because of it. I had watched him channel all of that immense outlook, strategic power, and terrifying influence into a fortress designed entirely to protect and cherish us. I cleared my throat slightly, breaking the peaceful spell of the nursery, as I quietly informed him that Derek's high-priced corporate defense lawyer had officially called my phone yesterday afternoon. I felt Dante's entire frame instantly stiffen against mine, the warm, tender lover vanishing in a heartbeat as the cold, calculating mask of the Mafia sovereign settled over his hard features. His voice dropped into a dangerously neutral, gravelly whisper as he demanded to know exactly what the bastard-s legal representative wanted from me. I explained calmly that the call was merely a formal notification to inform me that Derek Morrison had been officially arrested and processed by federal authorities. He was currently being held on sweeping federal indictment charges for aggravated embezzlement, grand larceny, and corporate fraud. I looked at him knowingly, noting that apparently his criminal associate wasn't the singular person Derek had stupidly chosen to steal from over the past 18 months. Dante's expression remained perfectly unreadable, a faint, blade-thin smile playing at the edge of his lips as he murmured that it apparently was a widespread pattern of behavior. I tilted my head, looking straight into his dark eyes as I asked him directly if he had a personal hand in orchestrating the sudden speed of the federal investigation. Dante didn't flinch, He shrugged his massive shoulders slightly, admitting with a chillingly calm honesty that he may have personally ensured certain unassailable financial records and digital tracking evidence reached the exact desks of the right people at the absolute right clinical time. His arms tightened around my waist with a sudden, bruising possessiveness as he looked down at me, stating with a dead serious gravity that Derek had made himself a constant, unpredictable threat to the safety of my daughter and myself. And because of that, he had systematically eliminated the threat from our reality. He offered absolute no apologies for using the legal system as a surgical weapon to crush my ex. A month ago, my stubborn pride would have forced me to lecture him about vigilante justice and the sanctity of letting the system work on its own terms. But as I stood there in his arms, looking at the pristine nursery and remembering the terror of Derek as frantic pounding on my studio apartment door, my perspective had completely transformed. I tightened my grip around his neck, my voice a soft, fierce whisper as I looked into his monstrously beautiful face and delivered a single, absolute phrase. Thank you. I thanked him for putting the coward behind federal bars where he belonged. Thanked him for shielding us from the collateral damage of a criminal war. And thanked him for being the rare kind of powerful man who doesn't walk away when the reality of life becomes incredibly complicated and heavy. Dante's eyes flared with a primal, satisfied fire at my submission, and he bent his head to capture my lips in a deep, roaring kiss that made my knees buckle against his slacks, murmuring against my mouth that he would never, ever walk away from what was his. He pulled back slightly, his thumb slow tracing my lower lip as he claimed me completely with his gaze, murmuring that I and Sophia belonged to him now, and he always protected his property. I smiled faintly against his mouth, whispering that his possessiveness was entirely out of control, and he let out a low, ragged laugh, telling me to get used to it because it was a permanent feature of my life. The intimate moment was interrupted by a soft, polite cough from the doorway, and we turned to find Maria standing on the threshold, a warm, knowing smile etching her kind features. She announced gently that a fresh breakfast had been laid out for us on the terrace, but added with a sudden touch of seriousness that Mr. Salvatore's senior legal counsel had just arrived at the front gates, carrying the specific legal documents Dante had requested earlier that week. I looked up at Dante questioningly, noting the sudden, uncharacteristic flash of literal nervousness that crossed his hard features, a sight so profoundly rare it would have been funny if my own heart hadn't instantly begun to race against my ribs. He reached into the inner breast pocket of his tailored suit jacket, his large fingers trembling slightly as he pulled out a crisp, heavy sheaf of official papers stamped with the seals of the family court. He held them out to me, his voice dropping into a low, quiet whisper that vibrated with an intense gravity as he revealed that they were formal adoption papers for Sophia. He looked down at the documents, then back into my eyes, stating with a raw, piercing devotion that if I would grant him my permission, he wanted to officially give my daughter his name, making it legal and permanent that she was his daughter in every single way that mattered to human law. He explained calmly that, as a direct condition of his federal plea deal to avoid additional, far more lethal charges from the Salvatore network, Derek had officially signed a binding legal document waiving every single one of his parental rights to the child. The coward had effortlessly abandoned his own blood just to shave a few years off his impending prison sentence, meaning that, from a strict legal standpoint, there was absolutely nothing left standing in the way of the adoption. Nothing except my explicit permission. Tears blurred my vision instantly, hot and thick as they spilled over my eyelashes and traced down my cheeks. I choked out a broken question, asking him if he truly wanted to adopt her as his own. Dante's thumb caught the tears sliding down my face, his gold-flecked eyes burning into mine with an absolute, unyielding certainty as he swore that he wanted to be her true father. He wanted her to grow up carrying the immense weight, privilege, and absolute protection of the Salvatore name, ensuring she would never for a single second of her life have to question whether she was wanted, loved, or valued by the man providing for her. He reminded me softly that this was entirely my decision, a choice that belonged solely to the mother who had broken herself to keep her safe. I looked over his shoulder at Sophia, who was resting so peacefully and securely in her designer crib, completely insulated from the poverty and terror we had left behind on the cracked asphalt of the city slums. Then I looked back at the dangerous, beautiful man who had crashed into our desperate lives like a catastrophic storm and somehow transformed himself into our absolute salvation. I thought about our future, a future that would never be completely perfect or devoid of danger given his position, but a future that would be fiercely loved, protected, and bound together by an unbreakable family dynamic. I wiped the moisture from my cheeks, looked into his eyes, and delivered the words that sealed our lives forever, whispering a fierce, absolute yes. A radiant, devastating smile broke across Dante's sharp face, entirely transforming him from a cold mafia sovereign into a man filled with pure, unadulterated triumph as he gathered me into his arms and swore that she was officially, legally, and permanently ours. The devastating smile that broke across Dante's sharp face lingered in the quiet air of the nursery, transforming his hard, predatory features into a look of pure, unadulterated triumph. He held me against his chest for what felt like an eternity, the heavy, rhythmic beat of his heart serving as the final, absolute confirmation that the fractured pieces of our lives had finally fused into something unbreakable. Before I could even find my breath to respond to the legal finality of the adoption papers, Dante pulled back slightly, his gold-flecked eyes locking onto mine with an intensity that burned straight down to my bones. He reached into the inner pocket of his charcoal suit jacket once more, his large, calloused fingers revealing a second document, a marriage license, half filled out in his elegant, precise script. He looked down at me, his deep voice dropping into a low, gravelly whisper that left no room for retreat as he commanded me simply to marry him, to let him make us a family not just in practice, but in name, and give us everything we truly deserved. I stared at the crisp white paper, a helpless, breathless laugh escaping my lips as I murmured that the sheer velocity of his decisions was completely insane. But Dante merely stepped closer, his chest pressing firmly against mine as he pointed out that it was perfect, whispering that he had prepared the license just in case, because he wasn't about to risk me coming to my senses and running away from the sanctuary we had built. I looked past his broad shoulders at our daughter sleeping so peacefully in her designer bassinet, then back into the fierce, devoted face of the mafia sovereign, who had systematically dismantled every threat to our survival. My old, stubborn need for absolute independence, the defensive wall I had built on the cracked concrete of the city slums, completely dissolved under the weight of his absolute devotion. I was already his. Had been since that first intimate night on the terrace, when he had promised to hold the wolves of the world at bay, and I knew that waiting a day, a month, or a year wouldn't change the formatting of our destiny. I leaned into his immense warmth, looking straight into his dangerous, beautiful eyes, and whispered a fierce, absolute yes to his proposal, telling him let us make it completely official before the lawyers down the hall grew impatient. Dante let out a low, ragged growl of pure satisfaction, scooping my body completely off the marble floor in a triumphant embrace that made me laugh aloud, before carrying me down the grand staircase to sign the documents that would bind our souls forever under the Salvatore name. 3 months later, I stood in the center of the estate as magnificent, sun-drenched gardens, wearing a simple, flowing white dress that brushed softly against the manicured grass. The brutal heat of September had long since melted into a crisp, golden autumn afternoon, the fading sunlight painting the horizon in shades of soft amber and bruised gold. There was no massive, ostentatious media display, no high society politicians, and no elaborate performance for the public eye. It was a deeply private, sacred gathering of a handful of witnesses who had guarded our sanctuary through the storm. Marco stood near the iron gates. His calculating eyes swept the perimeter one final time before dropping his gaze in respect, while Luca leaned against a stone pillar with a rare, relaxed smile etching his soldier-esque features. Maria stood just a few feet away from the altar, her deeply lined face illuminated by happy tears as she gently cradled a beautifully alert, thriving Sophia in her capable arms. Dante stood before me at the altar, looking like absolute sin personified in a tailored black tuxedo. But the dangerous mask of the mafia boss had completely vanished, replaced by a raw, piercing devotion that missed absolutely nothing as he reached out to clasp my hands, as we exchanged our sacred, unyielding vows under the setting sun, our voices steady and entirely devoid of the terror that had once dictated our existence. I realized with crystalline clarity that walking into his world had been the single best decision I had ever made. When he finally stepped forward, his massive arms banding around my waist to crush me against his chest, His lips captured mine in a deep, roaring kiss that tasted of absolute promise, protective provision, and perfect, terrifying love. He pulled back a mere fraction of an inch, his thumb slow tracing my lower lip as he murmured the title against my mouth, calling me Mrs. Salvatore. I smiled up into his monstrously beautiful face, my heart hammering with pure, unadulterated triumph as I returned the sentiment, calling him Mr. Salvatore, fully prepared to navigate the dangerous, complicated realities of his empire, because we were no longer fighting the wolves alone. We walked slowly back toward the stone fortress together, his heavy, possessive arm wrapped securely around my waist, while Maria followed closely behind, with her daughter cradled safely between us. Our family was unconventional, forged in the depths of desperation, and bound by a dangerous man as unyielding obsession. But as I looked at the towering concrete walls that kept the cruelty of the world at bay, I knew we were completely, perfectly, and terrifyingly ours, and I wouldn't change a single thing. To the untrained eye, a mafia story is merely a landscape of unchecked power, wealth, and systemic violence. But as a writer who has spent decades exploring the shadowy corners of this genre, I know the truth is far more complex. The story of Emma Carter and Dante Salvatore is not a glorification of crime. It is a profound clinical study in human resilience, strategic survival, and the absolute necessity of mutual respect. It challenges our traditional understanding of independence and forces us to look at the harsh realities of the world through a lens of raw, unadulterated pragmatism. The story begins with a stark moral failure, Derek Morrison, a man acting entirely out of fragile ego and corporate greed, treating the birth certificate of his own daughter like a business contract. His refusal to sign, unless given a DNA test, exposes a profound truth about human nature. Weak men will always view immense responsibility as an inconvenient liability. In direct contrast, we see the instantaneous manifestation of true power in Dante Salvatore. Dante does not act out of reckless, emotional impulse. When he legally claims Emma's child at that hospital window, he is executing a masterclass in strategic protection. He uses the unyielding weight of his legal resources to dismantle a threat before a single drop of blood can be spilled. The core moral lesson embedded within this narrative is the redefinition of individual strength. For years, Emma believed that surviving alone on the cracked concrete of the city slums was the ultimate proof of her freedom. But the script shatters this illusion, showing us that stubborn pride in the face of absolute annihilation is not bravery. It is a dangerous trap. True wisdom lies in the capacity to recognize a powerful alliance, to leverage immense resources, to understand that bending under pressure does not mean you are broken. Bent things flex, adapt, and ultimately emerge infinitely stronger. Emma does not lose her sovereignty by stepping into Dante's fortress. She secures a launchpad for her daughter's future. Furthermore, this story touches a deep, human chord regarding redemption and loyalty. Dante Salvatore is a predator, an apex creature operating entirely outside the boundaries of ordinary society. Yet, within the locked corridors of his estate, he reveals profound reverence for the sanctity of motherhood and family. His obsession with Emma isn't built on superficial, decorative beauty. It is rooted in a deep, agonizing trauma from his past, the loss of his sister, Isabella, who died simply because she was too terrified to ask for help. By building a sanctuary for Emma and Sophia, Dante is searching for his own psychological salvation. Ultimately, this narrative teaches us that a true family is not defined by biological technicalities, but by an unyielding commitment to protect, cherish, and stand as an unbreakable wall against the cruelty of the world. It proves that sometimes salvation does not come wrapped in a fairy tale. It comes wrapped in danger. And the most courageous thing a human being can do is trust someone strong enough to catch them when they fall. This literary work is intended purely as fiction. Any similarities to real individuals or events are coincidental and arise solely from the nature of storytelling. The author does not claim accuracy regarding real-world details and does not intend to portray real-life circumstances.